tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. I do not draw this conclusion from any excessively moralistic estimate of our accomplishments and our abilities. I draw it far more from the movements which I see already on the way in the outside world. Critical times are approaching. The omens can be sensed everywhere. The world is once again about to shift its center of gravity. Displacements of power are in the offing. They will not take place without war and violence. From the Far East comes a threat not only to peace, but to life and liberty. Even if our country remains politically neutral, even if our whole nation unanimously abides by tradition, which is not the case, and attempts to remain faithful to Castilian ideals, that will be in vain. Some of our representatives in Parliament are already saying that Castilla is a rather expensive luxury for our country. The country may very soon be forced into serious rearmament, armaments for defensive purposes only, of course, and great economies will be necessary. In spite of the government's benevolent disposition toward us, much of the economizing will strike us directly. We are proud that our order and the cultural continuity it provides have cost the country as little as they have. In comparison with other ages, especially the early period of the Feuilletonistic age with its lavishly endowed universities, its innumerable consultants and opulent institutes, this toll is really not large. It is infinitesimal compared with the sums consumed for war and armaments during the century of wars. But before too long this kind of armament may once again be the supreme necessity. The generals will again dominate Parliament. And if the people are confronted with the choice of sacrificing Castilla or exposing themselves to the danger of war and destruction, we know how they will choose. Undoubtedly a bellicose ideology will burgeon. The rash of propaganda will affect youth in particular. Then scholars and scholarship, Latin and mathematics, education and culture, will be considered worth their salt only to the extent that they can serve the ends of war. The wave is already gathering, one day it will wash us away. Perhaps that will be as it should be. But for the present, my revered colleagues, we still possess that limited freedom of decision and action which is the human prerogative and which makes world history the history of mankind. We may still choose, in proportion to our understanding of events, in proportion to our alertness and our courage. We can, if we will, close our eyes, for the danger is still fairly far away. Probably we who are magisters today will be able to complete our terms of office in peace and lie down to die in peace before the danger comes so close that it is visible to all. But for me, and no doubt for others like me, such peace could not be had with a clear conscience. I would rather not continue to administer my office in peace and play glass bead games, contended that the coming of evils will probably find me no longer alive. Rather, it seems to me urgent to recollect that we too, non-political though we are, belong to world history and help to make it. Therefore I said at the beginning of this memorandum that my competence as Magister Ludi is compromised, since I cannot keep my mind from dwelling anxiously upon the future danger. I do not allow myself to imagine what form the disaster might assume for us and for me. But I cannot close my mind to the question, what have we and what have I to do in order to meet the danger? Permit me to say a few words more about this. I am not inclined to urge Plato's thesis that the scholar, or rather the sage, ought to rule the state. The world was younger in his time. And Plato, although the founder of a sort of Castilla, was by no means a Castilian. He was a born aristocrat, of royal descent. Granted, we too are aristocrats and form a nobility, but one of the mind, not the blood. I do not believe that man will ever succeed in breeding a hereditary nobility that is at the same time an intellectual nobility. That would be the ideal aristocracy, but it remains a dream. We Castilians are not suited for ruling, for all that we are civilized and highly intelligent people. If we had to govern, we would not do it with the force and naivete that the genuine ruler needs. Moreover, our proper field and real concern, cultivation of an exemplary cultural life, would be quickly neglected. Ruling does not require qualities of stupidity and coarseness, as conceited intellectuals sometimes think. But it does require wholehearted delight in extroverted activity, a bent for identifying oneself with outward goals, and of course also a certain swiftness and lack of scruple about the choice of ways to attain success. And these are traits that a scholar, for we do not wish to call ourselves sages, may not have and does not have, because for us contemplation is more important than action. And in the choice of ways to attain our goals we have learned to be as scrupulous and wary as is humanly possible. Therefore it is not our business to rule and not our business to engage in politics. We are specialists in examining, analyzing, and measuring. We are the guardians and constant verifiers of all alphabets, multiplication tables, and methods. We are the bureaus of standards for cultural weights and measures. Granted, we are many other things also. In some circumstances we can also be innovators, discoverers, adventurers, conquerors, and reinterpreters. But our first and most important function, the reason the people need us and keep us, is to preserve the purity of all sources of knowledge. In trade, in politics, and what have you, turning an X into a Y may occasionally prove to be a stroke of genius, but never with us. In former ages, during the wars and upheavals of so-called periods of grandeur, intellectuals were sometimes urged to throw themselves into politics. This was particularly the case during the late Feuilletonistic age. That age went even further in its demands, for it insisted that mind itself must serve politics or the military. Just as the church bells were being melted down for cannon, as hapless schoolboys were drawn on to fill the ranks of the decimated troops, so mind itself was to be harnessed and consumed as one of the materials of war. Naturally, we could not accept this demand. In emergencies, a scholar might be called from his lectern or his desk and made into a soldier. In some circumstances, he might volunteer for such service. In a country exhausted by war, the scholar must restrict himself in all material things, even to the point of sheer starvation. Surely all this is taken for granted. The higher a person's cultivation, the greater the privileges he has enjoyed, the greater must be his sacrifices in case of need. We hope that every Castalian would recognize this as a matter of course if the time should come. But although we are prepared to sacrifice our well-being, our comfort, and our lives to the people, when danger threatens, that does not mean that we are ready to sacrifice mind itself, the tradition and morality of our spiritual life, to the demands of the hour, of the people, or of the generals. He would be a coward who withdrew from the challenges, sacrifices, and dangers his people had to endure. But he would be no less a coward and traitor who betrayed the principles of the life of the mind to material interests, who, for example, left the decision on the product of 2 times 2 to the rulers. It is treason to sacrifice love of truth, intellectual honesty, loyalty to the laws and methods of the mind, to any other interests, including those of one's country. Whenever propaganda and the conflict of interests threatens to devalue, distort, and do violence to truth as it has already done to individuals, to language, to the arts, and to everything else that is organic and highly cultivated, then it is our duty to resist and save the truth, or rather the striving for truth, since that is the supreme article in our creed. The scholar who knowingly speaks, writes, or teaches falsehood, who knowingly supports lies and deceptions, not only violates organic principles. He also, no matter how things may seem at the given moment, does his people a grave disservice. He corrupts its air and soil, its food and drink. He poisons its thinking and its laws, and he gives aid and comfort to all the hostile, evil forces that threaten the nation with annihilation. The Castalian, therefore, should not become a politician. If need be, he must sacrifice his person, but never his fealty to the life of the mind. The mind of man is beneficent and noble only when it obeys truth. As soon as it betrays truth, as soon as it ceases to revere truth, as soon as it sells out, it becomes intensely diabolical. Then it becomes far worse than instinctual bestiality, which always retains something of the innocence of nature. I leave it to each of you, my esteemed colleagues, to reflect upon the duties of the order when the country and the order itself are imperiled. Certainly there will be a variety of opinions. I have my own, and after much consideration of all the questions I have posed here, I have for my part come to a clear conception of what seems to me desirable, of what my duty is. This leads me to a personal petition to the Honorable Board, with which I shall conclude my memorandum. Of all the masters composing our board, I as Magister Ludi am probably most remote from the outside world, by virtue of my office. The mathematician, the philologist, the physicist, the pedagogue, and all the other masters labor in fields which they share with the profane world. In the ordinary, non-Castalian schools of our country, mathematics and linguistics are part of the normal curriculum. Astronomy and physics have a place in the secular universities. Even the completely untutored make music. All these disciplines are age-old, much older than our order. They existed long before it and will outlive it. Only the glass bead game is our own invention, our speciality, our favorite, our toy. It is the ultimate, subtlest expression of our Castalian type of intellectuality. It is both the most precious and the most non-utilitarian, the most beloved and the most fragile jewel in our treasury. It is the first precious stone that will be destroyed if the continuance of Castalia is imperiled, not only because it is the frailest of our possessions, but also because to laymen it is undoubtedly the most dispensable aspect of Castalia. Therefore, when the time comes to save the country every needless expenditure, the elite schools will be contracted, the funds for the maintenance and expansion of the libraries and collections will be trimmed and ultimately eliminated, our meals will be cut down, our clothing allowance withdrawn, but all the principal subjects in our Universitas Literarum will be allowed to continue except for the glass bead game. Mathematics is needed, after all, to devise new firearms, but no one will believe, least of all the military, that closing the Vicus Lucerum and abolishing our game will cause the country and people the slightest loss. The glass bead game is the most outlying and most vulnerable part of our structure. Perhaps this explains why the Magister Ludi, head of our unworldliest discipline, should be the first to sense the coming calamity, or at any rate the first to express this feeling to our board. In case of political upheavals, therefore, especially if they involve war, I regard the glass bead game as a lost cause. It will deteriorate rapidly, however many individuals cling to it, and it will never be restored. The atmosphere which will follow a new era of wars will not condone it. It will vanish just as surely as did certain highly cultivated customs in musical history, such as the choruses of professional singers of the period around 1600, or the Sunday concerts of figured music in churches around 1700. In those days men's ears heard sounds whose angelic purity cannot be conjured up again by any amount of science or magic. In the same way the glass bead game will not be forgotten, but it will be irrecoverable, and those who study its history, its rise, flourishing, and doom, will sigh and envy us for having been allowed to live in so peaceful, cultivated, and harmonious a world of the mind. Although I am now Magister Ludi, I do not at all consider it my, or our, mission to prevent or postpone the ultimate end of our game. Beauty, even surpassing beauty, is perishable like all other things, as soon as it has become a historical phenomenon upon this earth. We know that and can grieve that it is so, but cannot seriously try to change it, for it is unalterable law. When the glass bead game is destroyed, Castalia and the world will suffer loss, but they will scarcely be aware of it at the moment, for at the time of great crisis they will be absorbed in saving whatever can still be saved. A Castalia without the game is conceivable, but not a Castalia without reverence for truth, without fidelity to the life of the mind. A board of educators can function without a Magister Ludi. But although we have almost forgotten it, Magister Ludi, of course, originally meant not the office we have in mind when we use the word, but simply schoolmaster. And the more endangered Castalia is, the more its treasures stale and crumble away, the more our country will need its schoolmasters, its brave and good schoolmasters. Teachers are more essential than anything else, men who can give the young the ability to judge and distinguish, who serve them as examples of the honoring of truth, obedience to the things of the spirit, respect for language. That holds not only for our elite schools, which will be closed down sooner or later, but also and primarily for the secular schools on the outside where burghers and peasants, artisans and soldiers, politicians, military officers, and rulers are educated and shaped while they are still malleable children. That is where the basis for the cultural life of the country is to be found, not in the seminars or in the glass bead game. We have always furnished the country with teachers and educators, and they are, as I have said, the best among us. But we must do far more than we have done hitherto. We must no longer rely on a constant influx of the best from the schools outside to help maintain our Castalia. More and more we must recognize the humble, highly responsible service to the secular schools as the chief and most honorable part of our mission. That is what we must seek to extend. Which brings me to my personal petition to the esteemed board. I herewith request the board to relieve me of my office as Magister Ludi and entrust to me an ordinary school, large or small, outside in the country, to let me staff it with a group of youthful members of our order. I would recruit as teachers those whom I could confidently expect to help instill our principles into young people out in the world. I hope that the esteemed board will deign to examine my petition and its reasoning with due benevolence and let me know its decisions. The master of the glass bead game. Postscript. Permit me to cite a remark of the Reverend Father Jacobus, which I noted down in the course of one of his private lessons. Times of terror and deepest misery may be in the offing. But if any happiness at all is to be extracted from that misery, it can be only a spiritual happiness, looking backward toward the conservation of the culture of earlier times, looking forward toward serene and stalwart defense of the things of the spirit in an age which otherwise might succumb wholly to material things. Tegularius did not know how little of his work was present in this memorandum. He was not shown the final version, although Neck did let him read two earlier, much more detailed drafts. The Magister Ludi dispatched the memorandum and awaited the board's answer with far less impatience than his friend. He had come to the decision not to involve Fritz in his further actions. He therefore forbade him to discuss the matter any more, merely indicating that it would surely be a long time before the board reacted to the memorandum. When in fact the reply arrived sooner than he had expected, Tegularius heard nothing about it. The letter from Hersland read, "To His Excellency the Magister Ludi in Waldsall. Esteemed colleague, the Directorate of the Order and the Assembly of Masters have taken note of your warm-hearted and perspicacious circular letter with more than ordinary interest. We have found your historical observations no less absorbing than your ominous picture of the future, and some of us will undoubtedly long continue to ponder and to draw profit from your reflections, which surely are not groundless. We have all recognized, with gladness and deep appreciation, the principles that inspire you, the truly Castalian principles of altruism. We see that you are motivated by a profound and by now almost instinctive love for our province, for its life and its customs, a concerned and at the moment somewhat over-anxious love. With equal gladness and appreciation we observe the personal overtones of that love, its spirit of sacrifice, its active impulse, its earnestness and zeal, and its heroic element. In all this we recognize the character of our glass bead game master as we know it. We see his energy, his ardor, his daring. How characteristic of the famous Benedictine's disciple that he does not study history as a mere scholarly end in itself, an aesthetic game to be regarded without emotion, but rather applies his historical knowledge directly to current needs, that his perceptions impel him to take certain measures. And, revered colleague, how perfectly it corresponds with your character that you should feel drawn not to political missions, not to posts of influence and honor, but to the role of simple Ludi Magister, that of a schoolmaster. Such are some of the impressions, some of the thoughts that were awakened by the very first reading of your circular letter. Most of your colleagues responded in much the same way. The board has not, however, been able to take a stand on your warnings and requests. We have met and held a lively discussion of your view that our very existence is threatened. Much was said about the nature, extent, and possible imminence of the dangers. The majority of our members obviously took these questions most seriously indeed, and grew quite heated in discussing them. But we are compelled to inform you that on none of these questions did a majority favor your view. The imaginative power and farsightedness of your historico-political observations was acknowledged, but none of your specific conjectures, or shall we say prophecies, was fully approved. None was accepted as wholly convincing. Only a few of us agreed with you, and then with reservations, even on the question of the degree to which the order and our Castalian system has shared the responsibility for the unusually long era of peace, or whether the order can even be held a factor in political history. In the view of the majority, the calm that has descended upon our continent must be ascribed partly to the general prostration following the bloodlettings of the terrible wars, but far more to the fact that the Occident has ceased to be the focal point of world history and the arena in which claims to hegemony are fought out. Certainly we would not wish to cast doubt upon the true achievements of our order. Nevertheless, we cannot grant that the Castalian ideal, the ideal of high culture under the aegis of disciplined meditation, has any powers to shape history, any vital influence upon world political conditions. Urges or ambitions of this sort are totally alien to the Castalian mentality. Several serious disquisitions on the subject have stressed the point that Castalia seeks neither political sway nor influence on peace or war. Indeed, there could be no question of Castalia's having any such purpose, so the argument has gone, because everything Castalian is related to reason and operates within the framework of rationality, which certainly could not be said of world history, or said only by someone willing to revert to the theological and poetic sentimentalities of romantic historical philosophy. From that vantage point, of course, the whole murderous, destructive course of political history could be explained as merely the method of cosmic reason. Moreover, even the most casual survey of the history of thought shows that the great ages of culture have never been adequately explained by political conditions. Rather, culture or mind, or soul, has its own independent history, a second, secret, bloodless, and sanctified history, running parallel to what is generally called world history, by which we mean incessant struggles for material power. Our order deals only with this sanctified and secret history, not with real, brutal world history. It can never be our task to be continually taking soundings in political history, let alone to help to shape it. It therefore does not matter whether or not the political constellation is really as your circular letter suggests. In any case, our order has no right to do anything about it. Our only position must be one of patient waiting to see what comes. And therefore your argument that this constellation requires us to take an active position was decisively rejected by the majority, with only a few votes in its favor. Your views of the present world situation and your suggestions regarding the immediate future obviously impressed most of our colleagues. In fact, some of them were thunderstruck. But here too, although most of the speakers manifested respect for your knowledge and acuity, there was no evidence that the majority agreed with you. On the contrary, the consensus was that your comments on this matter were remarkable and extremely interesting, but excessively pessimistic. One colleague raised his voice to ask whether it might not be described as dangerous, if not outrageous, but surely frivolous, for a magister to alarm his board by such sinister images of allegedly imminent perils and tribulations. Certainly an occasional reminder of the perishability of all things was permissible. Every man, and especially everyone holding a high position of responsibility, must occasionally cry out to himself the memento mori. But to announce in such sweeping terms the impending doom of the entire body of masters, the entire order, and the entire hierarchy was a tasteless assault upon the tranquility and the imagination of his colleagues, and threatened the efficiency of the board itself. The work of a magister surely could not profit by his going to his office every day with the thought that his position itself, his labors, his pupils, his responsibility to the order, his life for and in Castalia, that all this might be wiped out by tomorrow or the day after. Although the majority did not support the colleague who raised this objection, he received considerable applause. We shall keep our present communication brief, but are at your disposal for a discussion in person. From our brief summary you can already see that your circular letter has not had the effect you may have hoped for. In large part its failure no doubt is based on objective grounds, the incompatibility of your opinions with those of the majority. But there are also purely formal reasons. At any rate it seems to us that a direct personal discussion between yourself and your colleagues would have taken a significantly more harmonious and positive course. We would moreover suggest that it was not only your couching of the matter in the form of a written memorandum that affected the board adversely. Far more striking was your combining, in a way highly unusual among us, a professional communication with a personal request, a petition. Most of your colleagues consider this fusion an unfortunate attempt at innovation, some bluntly called it impermissible. This brings us to the most delicate point of all, your request for release from your office and transfer to some secular school system. The petitioner should have realized from the outset that the board could not possibly approve so sudden and curiously argued a request. Of course the board's reply is, no. What would become of our hierarchy if the order no longer assigned each man to his place? What would become of Castalia if everyone wished to assess his own gifts and aptitudes and choose his position for himself? We suggest that the master of the glass bead game reflect upon this subject for a few minutes, and bid him to continue administering the honorable office he has been entrusted with. In saying this we have met your request for a reply to your letter. We have been unable to give the answer you may have hoped for. But we should also like to express our appreciation for the stimulating and admonitory value of your document. We trust we will be able to discuss its content with you orally and in the near future. For although the Directorate of the Order believes that it can rely on you, that point in your memorandum in which you speak of an incapacity to conduct the affairs of your office naturally gives us grounds for concern. Knecht read the letter without any great expectations, but with the closest attention. He had expected that the board would have grounds for concern, and moreover had had signs that it was truly worried. A guest from Hersland had recently come to the players' village, provided with a regular pass and a recommendation from the Directorate of the Order. He had requested hospitality for a few days, supposedly for work in the archives and library, and had also asked permission to audit a few of Knecht's lectures. An elderly man, silent and attentive, he had turned up in almost all the departments and buildings of the village, had inquired after Tegularius, and had several times called on the director of the Waldsall Elite School, who lived in the vicinity. There could scarcely be any doubt that the man had been sent as an observer to determine whether there were any traces of negligence in the player's village, whether the magister was in good health and at his post, the officials diligent, the students stimulated. He had stayed for a full week and missed none of Connect's lectures. Two of the officials had even commented on his quiet ubiquitousness. Evidently the directorate of the order had waited for the report from this investigation before dispatching its reply to the magister. What was he to think of this answer, and who had probably been its author? The style betrayed nothing. It was the conventional, impersonal officialese the occasion demanded. But on subtler analysis the letter revealed more individuality than he had thought at first reading. The basis of the entire document was the hierarchic spirit, a sense of justice and love of order. It was plain to see how unwelcome, inconvenient, not to say troublesome and annoying Connect's petition had been. Its rejection had undoubtedly been decided at once by the author of this reply, without regard to the opinions of others. On the other hand, the vexation was leavened by another emotion, for there was a clear note of sympathy present in the letter, with its mention of all the more lenient and friendly comments Connect's petition had received during the meeting of the board. Knecht had no doubt that Alexander, the president of the order, was the author of this reply. We have now reached the end of our journey, and hope that we have reported all the essentials of Joseph Connect's life. A later biographer will no doubt be in a position to ascertain and impart a good many additional details about that life. We forbear to present our own account of the magister's last days, for we know no more about them than every Waldsall student and could not tell the story any better than the legend of the Magister Ludi, many copies of which are in circulation. Presumably it was written by some of the departed magister's favorite students. With this legend we wish to conclude our book. 12. The Legend. When we listen to our fellow students talk about our master's disappearance, about the reasons for it, the rightness or wrongness of his decisions and acts, the meaning or meaninglessness of his fate, it sounds to us like Diodorus Siculus explaining the supposed causes for the flooding of the Nile. We would think it not only useless but wrong to add to such speculations. Instead, we wish to preserve in our hearts the memory of our master, who so soon after his mysterious departure into the world passed over into a still more mysterious beyond. His memory is dear to us, and for this reason we wish to set down what we have learned about these events. After the master had read the letter in which the board denied his petition, he felt a faint shiver, a matutinal coolness and sobriety which told him that the hour had come, that from now on there could be no more hesitating or lingering. This peculiar feeling, which he was wont to call awakening, was familiar to him from other decisive moments of his life. It was both vitalizing and painful, mingling a sense of farewell and of setting out on new adventures, shaking him deep down in his unconscious mind like a spring storm. He looked at the clock. In an hour he had to face a class. He decided to devote the next hour to meditation, and went into the quiet magister's garden. On his way a line of verse suddenly sprang into his mind. In all beginnings is a magic source. He murmured this under his breath, uncertain where he had read it. The line appealed to him and seemed to suit the mood of this hour. In the garden, he sat down on a bench strewn with the first faded leaves, regulated his breathing, and fought for inner tranquility, until with a purged heart he sank into contemplation in which the patterns of this hour in his life arranged themselves in universal, superpersonal images. But on the way to the small lecture room, the line of verse came back to him. He turned the words over in his mind, and thought that he did not have them quite right. Suddenly his memory cleared. Under his breath he recited, "In all beginnings dwells a magic force, for guarding us arid helping us to live." But it was not until nearly evening, long after his lecture was over and he had passed on to all sorts of other routine matters, that he discovered the origin of the verses. They were not the work of some old poet, they came from one of his own poems, which he had written in his student days. He remembered now that the poem had ended with the line, "So be it, heart, bid farewell without end." That very evening he sent for his deputy and informed him that on the morrow he would have to leave for an indefinite time. He put him in charge of all current affairs, with brief instructions, and bade good-bye in a friendly and matter-of-fact way, as he would ordinarily have done before departing on a brief official journey. He had realized some time earlier that he would have to leave without informing his friend Tegularius and burdening him with farewells. This course was essential, not only to spare his oversensitive friend, but also in order not to endanger his whole plan. Presumably Fritz would make his peace with the accomplished fact, whereas an abrupt disclosure and a farewell scene might lead to a regrettable emotional upheaval. Knecht had for a while even thought of departing without seeing Fritz for the last time. But now he decided that it would seem too much like evading a difficult encounter. However wise it was to spare his friend agitation and an occasion for follies, he had no right to make the thing so easy for himself. A half-hour remained before bedtime. He could still call on Tegularius without disturbing him or anyone else. Night had already settled in the broad inner courtyard as he crossed to his friend's cell. He knocked with that strange feeling of, "This is the last time," and found Tegularius alone. Delighted, Fritz laid aside the book he had been reading and invited Knecht to sit down. "An old poem came to my mind today," Knecht remarked casually, or rather a few lines from it. "Perhaps you know where the rest can be found." And he quoted, In all beginnings dwells a magic force. Tegularius traced it with no great trouble. After a few minutes of reflection he recognized the poem, got up, and produced from a desk drawer the manuscript of Knecht's poems, the original manuscript which Knecht had once presented to him. He looked through it and brought out 2 sheets of paper containing the first draft of the poem. Smilingly, he held them out to the magister. "Here," he said, "your excellency may examine them himself. This is the first time in many years that you have deigned to remember these poems." Joseph Knecht studied the 2 sheets attentively and with some emotion. In his student days, during his stay in the College of Far Eastern Studies, he had covered these 2 sheets of paper with lines of verse. They spoke to him of a remote past. Everything about them, the faintly yellowed paper, the youthful handwriting, the deletions and corrections in the text, reminded him painfully of almost forgotten times. He thought he could recall not only the year and the season when these verses had been written, but even the day and the hour. There came to him now the very mood, that proud and strong feeling that had gladdened him and found expression in the poem. He had written it on one of those special days on which he had experienced that spiritual shock which he called awakening. The title of the poem had obviously been written even before the poem itself, and had seemingly been intended as the first line. It had been set down in a large impetuous script, and read, "Transcend." Later, at some other time, in a different mood and situation, this title as well as the exclamation mark had been crossed out, and in smaller, thinner, more modest letters another title had been written in. It read, "Stages." Knecht now remembered how at the time, filled with the idea of his poem, he had written down the word, "transcend," as an invocation and imperative, a reminder to himself, a newly formulated but strong resolve to place his actions and his life under the aegis of transcendence, to make of it a serenely resolute moving on, filling and then leaving behind him every place, every stage along the way. Almost whispering, he read some lines to himself. "Serenely let us move to distant places. And let no sentiments of home detain us. The cosmic spirit seeks not to restrain us, but lifts us stage by stage to wider spaces." I had forgotten these lines for many years, he said, and when they happened to come to my mind today, I no longer knew how I knew them and didn't realize they were mine. How do they strike you today? Do they still mean anything to you? Tegularius considered. "I have always had a rather odd feeling about this particular poem," he said finally. "The poem itself is among the very few you've written that I didn't really like. There was something about it that repelled or disturbed me. At the time I had no idea what it was. Today I think I see it. I never really liked this poem of yours, which you headed, Transcend, as if that were a marching order. Thank God you later substituted a better title. I never really liked it because it has something didactic, moralizing, or schoolmasterly about it. If this element could be stripped away, or rather if this whitewash could be scrubbed off, it would be one of your finest poems. I've just realized that again. The real meaning is rather well suggested by the title, Stages, although you might just as well and perhaps better have called it, Music, or The Nature of Music. For if we discount the moralizing or preachy attitude, it is really about the nature of music, or if you will a song in praise of music, of its serenity and resolution, its quality of being constantly present, its mobility and unceasing urge to hasten on, to leave the space it has only just entered. If you contented yourself with this contemplation or praise of the spirit of music, if you had not turned it into an admonition and sermon, though obviously you had pedagogic ambitions even then, the poem might have been a perfect jewel. But as it stands it seems to me not only too hortatory but also afflicted by faulty logic. It equates music and life solely for the sake of the moral lesson. But that is highly questionable and disputable, for it transforms the natural and morally neutral impulse which is the mainspring of music into a life that summons, calls, commands us, and wants to impart good lessons to us. To put it briefly, in this poem a vision, something unique, beautiful, and splendid, has been falsified and exploited for didactic ends, and it is this aspect that always prejudiced me against it. The magister had been listening with pleasure as his friend worked himself up into that angry ardor which he so liked in him. "Let's hope you're right," he said half-jokingly. "You certainly are right in what you say about the poem's relationship to music. The idea of serenely moving to distant places and the underlying concept of the lines actually does come from music, without my having been conscious of it. I really don't know whether I corrupted the idea and falsified the vision. You may be right. When I wrote the poem, at any rate, it no longer dealt with music, but with an experience, the very experience that the lovely parable of music had revealed its moral aspect to me and become, within me, an awakening and an admonition to respond to the summons of life. The imperative form of the poem, which so particularly displeases you, is not the expression of any desire to command or teach, because the command is addressed to myself alone. That should have been clear from the last line, my friend, even if you weren't already well aware of it. I experienced an insight, a perception, an inward vision, and was bent on telling the content and the moral of this insight to myself, and impressing it on my mind. That is why the poem remained in my memory, although I was not conscious of it. So whether these lines are good or bad, they've accomplished their purpose. The admonition remained alive inside me and was not forgotten. Today I hear it again as if it were brand new. That's a fine little experience, and your mockery can't spoil it for me. But it's time for me to go. How lovely were those days, my friend, when we were both students and could so often allow ourselves to break the rules and stay together far into the nights, talking. A magister can no longer allow himself such luxuries, more's the pity. Oh, Tegularius said, he could allow it, it's a question of not having the courage. Laughing, Necht placed a hand on his shoulder. As far as courage goes, my boy, I might be guilty of worse pranks than that. Good night, old grumbler. Gaily, he left the cell. But on the way out through the deserted corridors and courtyards of the Vicus Lucerum his seriousness returned, the seriousness of parting. Leave-takings always stir memories. Now, on this nocturnal walk, he remembered that first time he had strolled through Waldsall and the Vicus Lucerum as a boy, a newly arrived Waldsall pupil, filled with misgivings and hopes. Only now, moving through the coolness of the night in the midst of silent trees and buildings, did he realize with painful sharpness that he was seeing all this for the last time, listening for the last time to silence and slumber stealing over the player's village, by day so lively, for the last time seeing the little light above the gatekeeper's lodge reflected in the basin of the fountain, for the last time watching the clouds in the night sky sailing over the trees of his magister's garden. Slowly, he went over all the paths and into all the nooks and corners of the player's village. He felt an impulse to open the gate of his garden once more and enter it, but he did not have the key with him, and that fact swiftly sobered him and caused him to collect himself. He returned to his apartment, wrote a few letters, including one to Designori announcing his arrival in the capital, and then spent some time in careful meditation to calm his intense emotions, for he wanted to be strong in the morning for his last task in Castalia, the interview with the head of the order. The following morning the magister rose at his accustomed hour, ordered his car, and drove off. Only a few persons noticed his departure and none gave it any thought. The morning seemed to be drowning in the mists of early autumn as he drove toward Hersland. He arrived toward noon and asked to be announced to Magister Alexander, the president of the order. Under his arm he carried, wrapped in a cloth, a handsome metal casket normally kept in a secret compartment in his office. It contained the insignia of his office, the seals and the keys. He was received with some surprise in the main office of the order. It was almost unprecedented for a magister to appear there unannounced and uninvited. On instructions from the president of the order he was given lunch, then shown to a rest cell in the old cloisters and informed that His Excellency hoped to be able to find time for him in 2 or 3 hours. He asked for a copy of the rules of the order, settled down with it and read through the entire booklet, to assure himself once more of the simplicity and legality of his plan. Nevertheless, even at this late hour he could not see how to put into words its meaning and its psychological justification. There was a paragraph in the rules that had once been assigned to him as a subject for meditation, in the last days of his youthful freedom. That had been shortly before his admission into the order. Now, reading the paragraph again, he meditated on it once more, and while doing so he became aware of how utterly different a person he was now from the rather anxious young tutor he had then been. If the high board summons you to a post, the passage read, know this. Each upward step on the ladder of officialdom is not a step into freedom, but into constraint. The greater the power of the office, the stricter the servitude. The stronger the personality, the more forbidden is the arbitrary exercise of will. How final and unequivocal all that had once sounded, but how greatly the meaning of so many of the words had changed, especially such insidious words as constraint, personality, will. And yet how beautifully clear, how well formed and admirably suggestive these sentences were. How absolute, timeless, and incontestably true they could appear to a young mind. Ah yes, and so they would have been, if only Castalia were the world, the whole multifarious but indivisible world, instead of being merely a tiny world within the greater, or a section boldly and violently carved out of it. If the earth were an elite school, if the order were the community of all men and the head of the order God, how perfect these sentences would be, and how flawless the entire rule. Ah, if only that had been so, how lovely, how fecund and innocently beautiful life would be. And once that had really been so, once he had been able to see it that way, the order and the Castalian spirit as equivalent to the divine and the absolute, the province as the world, Castalians as mankind, and the non-Castalian sphere as a kind of children's world, a threshold to the province, virgin soil still awaiting cultivation and ultimate redemption, a world looking reverently up to Castalia and every so often sending charming visitors such as young Plinio. How strange was his own situation, how strange the nature of Joseph Connect's own mind. In former days, and in fact only yesterday, had he not considered his own special kind of perception, that way of experiencing reality which he called awakening, as a slow, step-by-step penetration into the heart of the universe, into the core of truth, as something in itself absolute, a continuous path or progression which nevertheless had to be achieved gradually? In his youth he had thought it right and essential to acknowledge the validity of the outside world as Plinio represented it, but at the same time deliberately to hold aloof from it. At that time it had seemed to him progress, awakening, to make himself a Castalian. And again it had been progress, and his own truth, when after years of doubting he had decided in favor of the glass bead game and the life of Waldsall. It had been the same again when at Master Thomas's command he entered the service, was inducted into the order by the music master, and later when he accepted the appointment as magister. Each time he had taken a larger or smaller step on a seemingly straight road, and yet he now stood at the end of this road, by no means at the heart of the universe and the innermost core of truth. Rather, his present awakening, too, was no more than a brief opening of his eyes, a finding himself in a new situation, a fitting into new constellations. The same strict, clear, unequivocal, straight path that had brought him to Waldsall, to Marioffles, into the order, into the office of Magister Ludi, was now leading him out again. What had been a consequence of acts of awakening had likewise been a consequence of partings. Costalia, the game, the magistracy, each had been a theme which needed to be developed and dismissed. Each had been a space to pass through, to transcend. Already they lay behind him. And evidently, even in times past when he had thought and done the opposite of the things he was thinking and doing today, he had somehow known or at least dimly divined the dubiousness of it all. Had he not, in that poem written in his student days and dealing with stages and partings, placed above it the imperative title, transcend? Thus his path had been a circle, or an ellipse or spiral or whatever, but certainly not straight. Straight lines evidently belong only to geometry, not to nature and life. Yet he had faithfully obeyed the exhortation and self-encouragement of his poem, even after he had long forgotten the poem and the awakening he had then experienced. Granted, he had not obeyed perfectly, not without falterings, doubts, temptations, and struggles. But he had courageously passed through stage upon stage, space upon space, composedly and with reasonable serenity. Not with such radiant cheerfulness as the old music master, but without weariness and dejection, without disloyalty and defection. And if at this point he had at last become a defector from the Castalian point of view, if he were flouting all the morality of the order, seemingly serving only the needs of his own individuality, still, this too would be done in the spirit of courage and of music. No matter how it turned out, he would do it with serenity and a clean tempo. If only he had been able to clarify to Master Alexander what seemed so clear to him, if only he had been able to prove that the apparent willfulness of his present action was in reality service and obedience, that he was moving not toward freedom, but toward new, strange, and hitherto unknown ties. That he was not a fugitive, but a man responding to a summons, not headstrong, but obedient, not master, but sacrifice. And what about the virtues of serenity, firm tempo and courage? They dwindled in size perhaps, but remained intact. Even if he might not be advancing on his own, but was only being led, even if what he was undergoing was not independent transcending, but merely a revolving of the space outside him around himself as its center, the virtues persisted and retained their value and their potency. They consisted in affirmation instead of negation, in acceptance instead of evasion. And perhaps there might even be some small virtue in his conducting himself as if he were the master and an active focus, in accepting life and self-deception, with its corollaries self-determination and responsibility, without examining these things too closely. Perhaps it was inherently virtuous that for unknown reasons he was by nature more inclined to acting than acquiring knowledge, that he was more instinctual than intellectual. Oh, if only he could have a talk with Father Jacobus about these matters. Thoughts or reveries of this sort reverberated in him after his meditation. Awakening, it seemed, was not so much concerned with truth and cognition, but with experiencing and proving oneself in the real world. When you had such an awakening, you did not penetrate any closer to the core of things, to truth. You grasped, accomplished, or endured only the attitude of your own ego to the momentary situation. You did not find laws, but came to decisions. You did not thrust your way into the center of the world, but into the center of your own individuality. That, too, was why the experience of awakening was so difficult to convey, so curiously hard to formulate, so remote from statement. Language did not seem designed to make communications from this realm of life. If, once in a great while, someone were able to understand, that person was in a similar position, was a fellow sufferer undergoing a similar awakening. Fritz Tegularius had to some degree shared this insight. Plinio's understanding had gone somewhat further. Whom else could he name? No one. Twilight was already beginning to fall. He had been completely lost in his reflections, was altogether remote from his actual situation, when there came a knock on the door. Since he did not respond at once, the person outside waited a little and then tried once more, knocking softly. This time Knecht answered. He rose and went along with the messenger, who led him into the secretariat and without any further ado into the president's office. Master Alexander came forward to meet him. A pity you came without warning, so that we had to keep you waiting, he said. I am eager to hear what has brought you here so suddenly. Nothing bad, I hope? Knecht laughed. No, nothing bad. But do I really come so unexpectedly and have you no idea why I want to see you? Alexander gave him a troubled look. Well, yes, he said, I do have some idea. I had, for example, been thinking in the past few days that the subject of your circular letter had certainly not been treated adequately as far as you were concerned. The board was obliged to answer rather tersely, and perhaps both the tone and the substance of the answer were disappointing to you, Domini. Not at all, Joseph Knecht replied. I hardly expected any other answer as far as the substance of the board's reply went. And as for the tone, that pleased me greatly. I could tell that the reply had cost the author considerable effort, almost sorrow, and that he felt the need to mingle a few drops of honey in an answer that was necessarily unpleasant and rather a snub to me. Certainly he succeeded remarkably well, and I am grateful to him for that. Then you have taken the substance of the reply to heart, esteemed master? Taken note of it, and I should say that at bottom I have also understood it and approved it. I suppose the reply could not have been anything but a rejection of my petition, together with a gentle reprimand. My circular letter was something untoward, and altogether inconvenient to the board. I never for a moment doubted that. Moreover, insofar as it contained a personal petition, it probably was not couched in a suitable way. I could scarcely expect anything but a negative reply. "We are pleased," the president of the order said with a hint of acerbity, "that you regard it in this light and that our letter therefore could not have surprised you in any painful way. We are very pleased by that. But I still do not understand. If in writing your letter you already, I do understand you were right, don't I? Did not believe in its success, did not expect an affirmative answer, and in fact were convinced in advance that it would fail, why did you persist with it and go to the farther trouble? The whole thing must have involved considerable effort. Of making a clean copy and sending it out?" Knecht gave him an amiable look as he replied, "Your Excellency, my letter had two purposes, and I do not think that both were entirely fruitless. It contained a personal request that I be relieved of my post and employed at some other place. I could regard this personal request as relatively subsidiary, for every magister ought to regard his personal affairs as secondary, insofar as that is possible. The petition was rejected, I had to make the best of that. But my circular letter also contained something quite different from that request, namely a considerable number of facts and ideas which I thought it my duty to call to the attention of the board and to ask you all to weigh carefully. All the masters, or at any rate the majority of them, have read my exposition, let us not say my warnings, and although most of them were loath to ingest them and reacted with a good deal of annoyance, they have at any rate read and registered what I believed it essential to say. The fact that they did not applaud the letter is, to my mind, no failure. I was not seeking applause and assent, I intended rather to stir uneasiness, to shake them up. I would greatly regret if I had desisted from sending my letter on the grounds you mention. Whether it has had much or little effect, it was at least a cry of alarm, a summons." "Certainly," the president said hesitantly. "But that explanation does not solve the riddle for me. If you wished your admonitions, warnings, cries of alarm to reach the board, why did you weaken or at least diminish the effectiveness of your golden words by linking them with a private request, moreover a request which you yourself did not seriously believe would be or could be granted? For the present I don't understand that, but I suppose the matter will be clarified if we talk it over. In any case, there's the weak point in your circular letter, you're connecting the cry of alarm with the petition. I should think that you surely had no need to use the petition as a vehicle for your sermon. You could easily have reached your colleagues orally or in writing if you thought they had to be alerted to certain dangers. And then the petition would have proceeded along its own way through official channels." Knecht continued to look at him with the utmost friendliness. "Yes," he said lightly, "it may be that you are right. Still, consider the complications of the matter once more. Neither the admonition nor the sermon was anything commonplace, ordinary, or normal. Rather, both belong together in being unusual and in having arisen out of necessity and a break with convention. It is not usual and normal for anyone, without some urgent provocation from outside, to suddenly implore his colleagues to remember their mortality and the dubiousness of their entire lives. Nor is it usual and commonplace for a Castalian magister to apply for a post as schoolteacher outside the province. To that extent the two separate messages of my letter do belong together quite well. As I see it, a reader who had really taken the entire letter seriously would have had to conclude that this was no matter of an eccentric's announcing his premonitions and trying to preach to his colleagues, but rather that this man was in deadly earnest about his ideas and his distress, that he was ready to throw up his office, his dignity, his past, and begin from the beginning in the most modest of places, that he was weary of dignity, peace, honor, and authority and desired to be rid of them, to throw them away. From this conclusion, I am still trying to put myself into the mind of the readers of my letter. Two corollaries would have been possible, so it seems to me. The writer of this sermon is unfortunately slightly cracked, or else the writer of this troublesome sermon is obviously not cracked, but normal and sane, which means there must be more than whim and eccentricity behind his pessimistic preachments. And that, more, must then be a reality, a truth. I had imagined some such process in the minds of my readers, and I must admit that I miscalculated. My petition and my admonition did not support and reinforce each other. Instead, they were both not taken seriously and were laid aside. I am neither greatly saddened nor really surprised by this rejection, for at bottom, I must repeat, I did expect it to turn out that way. And I must also admit that I desired it so. For my petition, which I assumed would fail, was a kind of feint, a gesture, a formula. Master Alexander's expression had become even graver and overcast with gloom. But he did not interrupt the magister. The case was not, Knecht continued, that in dispatching my petition I seriously hoped for a favorable reply and looked forward joyfully to receiving it. But it is also not the case that I was prepared to accept obediently a negative answer as an unalterable decision from above. Not prepared to accept obediently a negative answer as an unalterable decision from above. Have I heard you aright, Magister? The president broke in, emphasizing every word. Evidently he had only at this point realized the full gravity of the situation. Knecht bowed slightly. Certainly you have heard aright. The fact was that I could scarcely believe my petition had much prospect of success, but I thought I had to make it to satisfy the requirements of decorum. By doing so I was, so to speak, providing the esteemed board with an opportunity to settle the matter in a relatively harmless way. But if it eschewed such a solution, I was in any case resolved neither to be put off nor soothed, but to act. And to act how? Alexander asked in a low voice. As my heart and my reason command. I was determined to resign my office and take on work outside Castalia even without an assignment or leave from the board. The head of the order closed his eyes and seemed to be no longer listening. Next saw that he was performing that emergency exercise used by members of the order in moments of sudden danger to regain self-control and inner calm. It consisted in twice emptying the lungs and holding the breath for long moments. As Necht watched, Alexander's face paled slightly, then regained color as he inhaled slowly, beginning with the muscles of the stomach. Necht was sorry to be inflicting psychic distress on a man whom he so highly esteemed, indeed loved. He saw Alexander's eyes open with a staring, abstracted look, then focus and grow keener. With a faint sense of alarm he saw those clear, controlled, disciplined eyes, the eyes of a man equally great in obeying and commanding, fixed upon him now, regarding him with cool composure, probing him, judging him. He withstood that gaze in silence for what seemed long minutes. "I believe I have now understood you," Alexander said at last in a quiet voice. "You have been weary of your office or weary of Castalia for a long time, or tormented by a craving for life in the world. You chose to pay more heed to this mood than to the laws and your duties. You also felt no need to confide in us and ask the order for advice and assistance. For the sake of form and to relieve your conscience, you then addressed that petition to us, a petition you knew would be unacceptable, but which you could refer to when the matter came up for discussion. Let us assume that you have reasons for such unusual conduct and that your intentions are honorable. I really cannot conceive them to have been otherwise. But how was it possible that with such thoughts, cravings, and decisions in your heart, inwardly already a defector, you could keep silent and remain in your office for so long a time, continuing to conduct it flawlessly, so far as anyone can see? I am here," the Magister Ludi replied with unaltered friendliness, "to discuss all this with you, to answer all your questions. And since I have resolved upon a course of self-will, I have made up my mind not to leave Hersland in your house until I know that you have gained some understanding of my situation and my action." Master Alexander considered. "Does that mean you expect me to endorse your conduct and your plans?" he asked hesitantly. "Oh, I have no thought of winning your endorsement. But I hope that you will understand me and that I shall retain a remnant of your respect when I go. This will be my one and only leave taking of our province. Today I left Waldsal and the Vicus Lucerum forever." Again Alexander closed his eyes for a few seconds. He felt battered by the revelations coming all at once from this incomprehensible man. "Forever?" he said. "Then you are thinking of not returning to your post at all? I must say, you are a master of surprises. One question, if I may ask it, do you still regard yourself as Magister Ludi?" Joseph Necht picked up the small casket he brought with him. "I was until yesterday," he said, "and consider myself liberated today by returning to you, as representative of the board, the seals and keys. The insignia are intact, and when you go to inspect things in the player's village you will find everything in order." Slowly, the president of the order rose. He looked weary and suddenly aged. "Let us leave your casket standing here for the present," he said dryly. "If by receiving the seals I am supposed to be accepting your resignation, let me remind you that I am not so empowered. At least a third of the board would have to be present. You used to have so much feeling for the old customs and forms that I cannot adjust so quickly to this new mode of doing things. Perhaps you will be kind enough to give me until tomorrow before we go on with our conversation? I am completely at your disposal, your reverence. You have known me and known my respect for you for a good many years. Believe me, that has not changed in the slightest. You are the only person I am bidding goodbye to before leaving the province, and I am addressing you now not only in your capacity as president of the order. Just as I have returned the seals and keys to your hands, I also hope you will release me from my oath as a member of the order, once we have discussed everything fully, Domini." Alexander met his eyes with a sorrowful, searching look and stifled a sigh. "Leave me now. You have given me cares enough for one day and provided material enough for reflection. Let that do for today. Tomorrow we shall speak further. Return here about an hour before noon." He dismissed the magister with a courteous gesture, and that gesture, full of resignation, full of deliberate politeness of the kind no longer meant for a colleague, but for a total stranger, pained the glass bead game master more than anything he had said. The attendant who fetched Necht for the evening meal a while later led him to a guest table and informed him that Master Alexander had withdrawn for meditation and assumed that the magister would not wish company tonight, and that a guest room had been prepared for him. The Magister Ludi's visit and announcement had taken Alexander completely by surprise. Ever since he had edited the board's reply to the circular letter, he had of course counted on Knecht's turning up sooner or later, and had thought of the ensuing discussion with faint uneasiness. But that Magister Necht, noted for his exemplary obedience, his cultivated formalities, his modesty and profound tact, could one day descend on him without warning, resign his office on his own initiative and without previously consulting the board, and throw over all usage and tradition in this startling manner, these were acts he would have considered absolutely impossible. Granted, Knecht's manner, tone, and language, his unobtrusive courtesy, were the same as ever, but how appalling and offensive, how novel and surprising, and above all how totally un-Castalian were the substance and the spirit of everything he said. No one hearing and seeing the Magister Ludi would have suspected him of being ill, overworked, irritated, and not completely master of himself. The scrutiny which the board had recently ordered in Waldsal had turned up not the slightest vestige of disturbance, disorder, or neglect in the life and work of the player's village. And nevertheless this appalling man, until yesterday the dearest of his colleagues, now stood here and deposited the chest with the insignia of office as if it were a suitcase, declaring that he had ceased to be magister, had ceased to be a member of the board, a brother of the order and a Castalian, and had dropped in only to say goodbye. This was the most disturbing situation his office as president of the order had ever involved him in, and he had had great difficulty in preserving his outward composure. And what now? Should he resort to force, place the Magister Ludi under house arrest, say, and at once, this very evening, send emergency messages to all members of the board and call a meeting? Was there any objection to his doing so? Was that not the most logical and correct procedure? It was, and yet something within him protested. What would he really achieve by such measures? Nothing but humiliation for Magister Knecht, and nothing at all for Castalia. At most some alleviation for himself, who would no longer have to face this ugly and complex situation alone, bearing all the responsibility. If anything could still be saved out of this vexatious affair, if any appeal to Knecht's sense of honor were possible, and if it were conceivable that he might change his mind, such an outcome could only be achieved in a private interview. The two of them, Knecht and Alexander, would have to fight out this bitter conflict to the end, no one else. And even as he thought this, he had to concede that basically Knecht had acted correctly and honorably by refraining from further contact with the board, which he no longer recognized, but coming personally to consult him, the president, for the final struggle and leave-taking. This man Joseph Knecht, even when he did something so outrageous and repulsive, nevertheless acted with taste and tact. Master Alexander decided to trust to his own powers of persuasion and leave the entire official apparatus out of the affair. Only now, after he had come to this decision, did he begin to reflect upon the details of the matter and to ask himself to what extent the magister's action was right or wrong, for after all, Knecht seemed to have no doubt of the integrity and justness of his incredible step. Now that he tried to classify the Magister Ludi's audacious plan and determine where it stood legally, for no one knew the rules of the order better than he came to the surprising conclusion that Joseph Knecht was not in fact violating the letter of the rules. Granted, for decades no one had ever tested the relevant clauses, but the rules did provide that every member of the order was at liberty to resign any time he so desired. Of course he would at the same time renounce all his privileges and separate himself from the Castalian community. If Knecht now returned his seals, informed the order of his resignation, and betook himself into the world, he was to be sure doing something unheard of in living memory, something highly unusual, alarming, and perhaps unseemly, but he was committing no infraction of the rules. Incomprehensible the step might be, but it was not illegal in any formal way. And that he chose not to take it behind the president's back, but was ready to come and announce his decision, was in fact more than punctilious. But how had this venerated man, one of the pillars of the hierarchy, come to such a decision? After all, what he was planning was nothing short of desertion. How could he invoke the written rules when 100 unwritten but no less sacred and self-evident ties should have kept him from taking this step? Alexander heard a clock strike. He wrenched himself away from his profitless thoughts, took his bath, spent 10 minutes on careful breathing exercises, and then went to his meditation cell in order to store up strength and tranquility for an hour before going to sleep. He would think no more of this matter until the morrow. Next morning a young servant of the directorate's guest house led the Magister Ludi to the president, and was thus privy to the way the two men greeted each other. Accustomed as the youth was to the manner prevalent among these masters of meditation and self-discipline, he was nevertheless struck by something in the appearance, the bearing, and the tone of these two notables as they greeted each other. There was something new, an extraordinary degree of composure and clarity. It was, so he told us, not quite the usual salutation between two of the highest dignitaries of the order, which might be either a serene and casual ceremony or an act of formal but joyful festivity, although occasionally it also turned into a competition in courtesy, deference, and stressed humility. It was rather as though a stranger were being received, say a great master of yoga come from afar to pay his respects to the president of the order and cross swords with him. In word and gesture both men were exceedingly modest and sparing, but their eyes and their expressions, though tranquil, collected, and composed, were charged with a hidden tension, as though both were luminescent or carrying an electric current. Our informant did not have the opportunity to see or hear any more of the encounter. The two vanished into the office, presumably going to Master Alexander's study, and remained there for several hours. No one was permitted to disturb them. What record we have of their conversations comes from accounts set down on various occasions by the Honorable Delegate Designori, to whom Joseph Knecht related some details. "You took me by surprise yesterday," the president began, "and very nearly disconcerted me. In the meantime I have been able to reflect upon the matter somewhat. My viewpoint has not changed, of course. I am a member of the board and the directorate of the order. According to the letter of the rule, you have the right to announce your withdrawal and resign your post. You have come to the point of regarding your post as burdensome and of feeling an attempt to live outside the order as a necessity. What if I were now to propose that you make this trial, but not in terms of your categorical decisions, rather in the form of a prolonged or even an indeterminate leave? Actually, this is what your petition sought to accomplish." "Not entirely," Knecht said. "If my petition had been approved, I would certainly have remained in the order, but not in office. Your kind proposal would be an evasion. Incidentally, Waldsall and the glass bead game would scarcely be well served by a magister who was absent on leave for a long or indeterminate period of time and who might or might not return. Moreover, if he did return after a year or two, his skills in the conduct of his office and in his discipline, the glass bead game, would only have suffered, not advanced. Alexander. He might have profited in all sorts of ways. Perhaps he would have learned that the world outside is not what he imagined and needs him no more than he does it. He might come back reassured and glad to remain in old and well-tested paths. Your kindness goes very far indeed. I am grateful for it, nevertheless I cannot accept it. What I am seeking is not so much fulfillment of idle curiosity or of a hankering for worldly life, but experience without reservations. I do not want to go out into the world with insurance in my pocket, in case I am disappointed. I don't want to be a prudent traveler taking a bit of a look at the world. On the contrary, I crave risk, difficulty, and danger. I am hungry for reality, for tasks and deeds, and also for deprivations and suffering. May I ask you not to press your kind proposal, and altogether to abandon any attempt to sway me and coax me back? It would lead to nothing. My visit with you would lose its value and its solemnity for me if it now brought me approval of my petition after all, when I no longer desire that. I have not stood still since writing that petition. The way I have embarked on is now my one and all, my law, my home, my service. With a sigh, Alexander nodded assent. Let us assume then, he said patiently, that you in fact cannot be influenced or dissuaded. Let us assume that contrary to all appearances you are deaf to all representations, all reason, all kindness, that you are running amok or going berserk, so that people must simply keep out of your path. For the time being I will not try to change your mind or influence you. But tell me what you came here to tell me. Let me hear the story of your defection. Explain the acts and decisions which are thus so shocking. Whether what you have to offer is a confession, a justification, or an indictment, I want to hear it. Neck nodded. Running amok though I am, I paused to express my gladness. I have no indictments to make. What I wish to say, if only it were not so hard, so incredibly hard to put into words, seems to me a justification. To you it may be a confession. He leaned back in his chair and looked up, where traces of Hersland's former days as a monastery showed in the vault of the ceiling, in sparse, dreamlike lines and colors, patterns of flowers and ornamentation. The idea that even a magister could tire of his post and resign at first came to me only a few months after my appointment as Magister Ludi. One day I was sitting reading a little book by my once famous predecessor Ludwig Wassermailer, a journal of the official year, in which he offers guidance to his successors. There I read his admonition to give timely thought to the public glass bead game for the coming year. If you felt no eagerness for it and lacked ideas, he wrote, you should try to put yourself into the right mood by concentration. With my strong awareness of being the youngest magister, I smiled when I read this. With the brashness of youth I was a bit amused at the anxieties of the old man who had written it. But still I also heard in it a note of gravity and dread, of something menacing and oppressive. Reflecting on this, I decided that if ever the day came when the thought of the next festival game caused me anxiety instead of gladness, fear instead of pride, I would not struggle to work out a new festival game, but would at once resign and return the emblems of my office to the board. This was the first time that such a thought presented itself to me. At the time I had just come through the great exertions of mastering my office, and had all my sails spread to the wind, so to speak. In my heart I did not really believe in the possibility that I too might someday be an old man, tired of the work and of life, that I might someday be unequal to the task of tossing off ideas for new glass bead games. Nevertheless, I made the decision at that time. You knew me well in those days, your reverence, better perhaps than I knew myself. You were my advisor and father confessor during that first difficult period in office, and had taken your departure from Waldsall only a short while before. Alexander gave him a searching look. I have scarcely ever had a finer assignment, he said, and was then content, in a way that one rarely is, with you and myself. If it is true that we must pay for everything pleasant in life, then I must now atone for my elation at that time. I was truly proud of you then. I cannot be so today. If you cause the order disappointment, if you shock all of Castalia, I know that I share the responsibility. Perhaps at that time, when I was your companion and advisor, I should have stayed in your player's village a few weeks longer, or handled you somewhat more roughly, subjected you to stricter examination. Necht cheerfully returned his look. You must not have such misgivings, Domini, or I should have to remind you of various admonishments you felt called upon to give me at the time when I, as the youngest magister, took the duties of my office too seriously. At one such moment you told me, I have just remembered this, that if I, the Magister Ludi, were a scoundrel or an incompetent and did everything a magister is forbidden to do, in fact if I deliberately set out to use my high position to do as much harm as possible, all this would no more disturb our dear Castalia or affect it any more profoundly than a pebble that is thrown into a lake. A few ripples and circles and all trace is gone. That is how firm, how secure our Castalian order is, how inviolable its spirit, you said. Do you recall? No, you were certainly not to blame for any efforts of mine to be as bad a Castalian as possible and to do the greatest possible harm to the order. Moreover, you also know that what I do cannot shake your own tranquility. But I want to go on with my story. The fact that I could make such a decision at the very beginning of my magistracy, and that I did not forget it, but am now about to carry it out, that fact is related to a kind of spiritual experience I have from time to time, which I call awakening. But you already know about that. I once spoke to you about it, when you were my mentor and guru. In fact, I complained to you at the time that since my accession to office that experience had not come to me, and seemed to be vanishing more and more into the distance. I remember, the president agreed. I was somewhat taken aback at the time by your capacity for this kind of experience. It is rather rare among us, whereas in the world outside it occurs in so many varied forms. Sometimes in the genius, especially in statesmen and generals, but also in feeble, semi-pathological, and on the whole rather meagerly gifted persons such as clairvoyants, telepaths, and mediums. You seem to me to have no kinship at all with these two types, the aggressive heroes or the clairvoyants and diviners. Rather you seemed to me then, and until yesterday, to be a good Castalian, prudent, clear-headed, obedient. I thought it completely out of the question that you should ever be the victim of mysterious voices, whether of divine or diabolic origin, or even voices from within your own self. Therefore I interpreted the states of awakening, which you described to me simply as your becoming aware occasionally of personal growth. Given that interpretation, it followed that these spiritual insights would not be coming your way for a considerable time. After all, you had just entered office and had assumed a task which still hung loosely around you like an overcoat too big for you. You would still have to grow into it. But tell me this. Have you ever believed that these awakenings are anything like revelations from higher powers, communications or summons from the realm of an objective, eternal, or divine truth? In saying this, Necht replied, you bring me to my present difficulty. To express in words something that refuses to be put into words, to make rational what is obviously extra-rational. No, I never thought of those awakenings as manifestations of a god or daimon or of some absolute truth. What gives these experiences their weight and persuasiveness is not their truth, their sublime origin, their divinity or anything of the sort, but their reality. They are tremendously real, somewhat the way of violent physical pain or a surprising natural event, a storm or earthquake, seem to us charged with an entirely different sort of reality, presence, inexorability, from ordinary times and conditions. The gust of wind that precedes a thunderstorm, sending us into the house and almost wrenching the front door away from our hand, or a bad toothache which seems to concentrate all the tensions, sufferings, and conflicts of the world in our jaw. These are such realities. Later on we may start to question them or examine their significance, if that is our bent, but at the moment they happen they admit no doubts and are brimful of reality. My awakening has a similar kind of intensified reality for me. That is why I have given it this name. At such times I really feel as if I had lain asleep or half asleep for a long time, but am now awake and clear-headed and receptive in a way I never am ordinarily. In history, too, moments of tribulation or great upheavals have their element of convincing necessity. They create a sense of irresistible immediacy and tension. Whatever the consequence of such upheavals, be it beauty and clarity or savagery and darkness, whatever happens will bear the semblance of grandeur, necessity, and importance and will stand out as utterly different from everyday events. He paused to catch his breath, then continued, but let me try to examine this matter from another angle. Do you recall the legend of Saint Christopher? Yes? Well now, Christopher was a man of great strength and courage, but he wanted to serve rather than to be a master and govern. Service was his strength and his art, he had a faculty for it. But whom he served was not a matter of indifference to him. He felt that he had to serve the greatest, the most powerful master. And when he heard of a mightier master, he promptly offered his services. I have always been fond of this great servant, and I must in some way resemble him. At any rate, during the one period in my life when I had command over myself, during my student years, I searched and vacillated for a long time before deciding what master to serve. For years I remained mistrustful of the glass bead game and fended it off, although I had long ago recognized it as the most precious and characteristic fruit of our province. I had tasted the bait and knew that there was nothing more attractive and more subtle on earth than the game. I had also observed fairly early that this enchanting game demanded more than naive amateur players, that it took total possession of the man who had succumbed to its magic. And an instinct within me rebelled against my throwing all my energies and interests into this magic forever. Some naive feeling for simplicity, for wholeness and soundness, warned me against the spirit of the Waldsal Vicus Lusorum. I sensed in it a spirit of specialism and virtuosity, certainly highly cultivated, certainly richly elaborated, but nevertheless isolated from humanity and the whole of life. A spirit that had soared too high into haughty solitariness. For years I doubted and probed, until the decision had matured within me and in spite of everything I decided in favor of the game. I did so because I had within me that urge to seek the supreme fulfillment and serve only the greatest master. I understand, Master Alexander said. But no matter how I regard it and no matter how you try to represent it, I come up against the same reason, for your singularities. You have an excessive sense of your own person, or dependence on it, which is far from the same thing as being a great personality. A man can be a star of the first magnitude in gifts, will power, and endurance, but so well balanced that he turns with the system to which he belongs without any friction or waste of energy. Another may have the same great gifts, or even finer ones, but the axis does not pass precisely through the center and he squanders half his strength in eccentric movements which weaken him and disturb his surroundings. You evidently belong to this type. Only I must admit that you have contrived to conceal it remarkably. For that very reason the malady seems to be breaking out now with all the greater virulence. You spoke of Saint Christopher, and I must say that although there is something grand and touching about this saint, he is not a model for a servant of our hierarchy. One who wishes to serve should abide by the master he has sworn to serve for good and ill, and not with the secret reservation that he will change as soon as he finds a more magnificent master. In assuming such an attitude, the servant makes himself his master's judge, and this indeed is what you are doing. You always want to serve the highest master, and are naive enough to decide for yourself the rank of the masters among whom you make your choice. Knecht had listened attentively, although a shadow of sadness passed across his face. Now he continued. I respect your opinion, and could not have imagined that it would be any different. But let me go on with my story just a little longer. I became Magister Ludi, and in fact was sure for a good while that I was serving the highest of all masters. At any rate, my friend Designori, our patron in the Federal Council, once described to me in extremely vivid terms what an arrogant, conceited, blasé elitist and virtuoso of the game one once was. But I must also tell you the meaning that the word transcend has had for me since my student years and my awakening. It came to me, I think, while reading a philosopher of the Enlightenment, and under the influence of Master Thomas von der Trave, and ever since then it has been a veritable magic word for me, like awakening, an impetus, a consolation, and a promise. My life, I resolved, ought to be a perpetual transcending, a progression from stage to stage. I wanted it to pass through one area after the next, leaving each behind, as music moves on from theme to theme, from tempo to tempo, playing each out to the end, completing each and leaving it behind, never tiring, never sleeping, forever wakeful, forever in the present. In connection with the experiences of awakening, I had noticed that such stages and such areas exist, and that each successive period in one's life bears within itself, as it is approaching its end, a note of fading and eagerness for death. That in turn leads to a shifting to a new area, to awakening and new beginnings. I am telling you about the significance to me of transcending in order to provide another clue which may help you interpret my life. The decision in favor of the glass bead game was an important stage, as was the first time I took my place in the hierarchy by accepting an assignment. I have also experienced such movements from stage to stage in my office as Magister. The best thing the office has given me was the discovery that making music and playing the glass bead game are not the only happy activities in life, that teaching and educating can be just as exhilarating. And I gradually discovered, furthermore, that teaching gave me all the more pleasure, the younger and more unspoiled by miseducation the pupils were. This too, like many other things, led me in the course of the years to desire younger and younger pupils, so that I would have liked most to have become a teacher in an elementary school. In short, at times my imagination dwelt on matters which in themselves lay outside my functions. He paused for a moment to rest. The president remarked, "You astonish me more and more, Magister. Here you are speaking about your own life, and you mention scarcely anything but subjective experiences, personal wishes, personal developments and decisions. I really had no idea that a Castalian of your rank could see himself and his life in such a light." His voice had a note between reproach and sorrow. It pained Knecht, but he remained equable and exclaimed merrily, "Esteemed Magister, we are not speaking about Castalia, about the board and the hierarchy at the moment, but only about me, about the psychology of a man who unfortunately has been forced to cause you great inconvenience. It would be improper for me to speak of my conduct of office, the way I have met my obligations, my value or lack of it as a Castalian and Magister. My conduct of office lies open before you. You can easily look into it, as you can into the entire exterior of my life. You will not find much to censure. But what we are concerned with here is something wholly different. I am trying to show you the path I have trodden as an individual, which has led me out of Waldsall and will lead me out of Castalia tomorrow. Please, be so kind as to listen to me a little while longer. My consciousness of a world outside our little province I owe not to my studies, in which this world occurred only as the remote past, but primarily to my fellow student Designori, who was a guest from outside, and later to my stay among the Benedictines, and to Father Jacobus. What I have seen of the world with my own eyes is very little, but Father Jacobus gave me an inkling of what is called history. And it may be that in acquiring that I was laying the groundwork for the isolation into which I stumbled after my return. I returned from the monastery into a land where history virtually didn't exist, into a province of scholars and glass bead game players, a highly refined and extremely pleasant society, but one in which I seemed to stand entirely alone with my smattering of the world, my curiosity about that world, and my sympathy for it. To be sure, there was enough to compensate me here. There were several men I revered, so that I felt all at once abashed, delighted, and honored to work with them as their colleague, and there were a large number of well-bred and highly cultivated people. There was also work aplenty and a great many talented and lovable students. The trouble was that during my apprenticeship under Father Jacobus I had made the discovery that I was not only a Castalian, but also a man. That the world, the whole world, concerned me and exerted certain claims upon me. Needs, wishes, demands, and obligations arose out of this discovery, but I was in no position to meet any of them. Life in the world, as the Castalian sees it, is something backward and inferior, a life of disorder and crudity, of passions and distractions, devoid of all that is beautiful or desirable. But the world and its life was in fact infinitely vaster and richer than the notions a Castalian has of it. It was full of change, history, struggles, and eternally new beginnings. It might be chaotic, but it was the home and native soil of all destinies, all exaltations, all arts, all humanity, It had produced languages, peoples, governments, cultures. It had also produced us in our Castalia and would see all these things perish again, and yet survive. My teacher Jacobus had kindled in me a love for this world which was forever growing and seeking nourishment. But in Castalia there was nothing to nourish it. Here we were outside of the world. We ourselves were a small, perfect world, but one no longer changing, no longer growing. He took a deep breath and fell silent for a while. Since the president made no reply, and only looked expectantly at him, he gave a pensive nod and continued, "For me, this meant bearing two burdens, and I did so for a good many years. I had to administer an important office and meet its responsibilities, and I had to deal with this love for the world. My office, I realized from the outside, must not suffer because of this love. On the contrary, I thought it ought to benefit. I hoped to carry out my duties as thoroughly and irreproachably as a magister is expected to. But if I should fall short in these, I nevertheless knew that inwardly I was more alert and alive than a good many of my more punctilious colleagues, and that I had something to give to my students and associates. I regarded it as my mission to expand Castalian life and thought slowly and gently without breaking with tradition, to add to its warmth, to infuse it with new blood from the world and from history. By the happy workings of Providence, at the same time, outside in our country, a man of the world had precisely the same thought. He dreamed of a rapprochement and interpenetration of Castalia and the world. That man was Plinio Designori. Master Alexander's mouth took on a slightly sour expression as he said, "Well, yes, I have never hoped for anything very good from this man's influence upon you, any more than I have from your spoiled protege Tegularius. So it is Designori who brought you to the point of a complete breach with the system?" "No, Domini, but he helped me, in part without being aware of it. He brought fresh air into my quietude. Through him I came into contact with the outside world again, and only then was I able to realize and to admit to myself that I was at the end of my career here, that I had lost all real joy in my work, and that it was time to put an end to the ordeal. One more stage had been left behind. I had passed through another area, another space, which this time was Castalia." "How you phrase that," Alexander remarked, shaking his head. "As if Castalian space were not large enough to serve a great many people worthily all their lives. Do you seriously believe that you have traversed this space and gone beyond it?" "Oh no," Knecht replied with strong feeling. "I've never believed anything of the sort. When I say that I have reached the border of this space, I mean only that I have done all that I as an official could do here. In this sense I have reached my limits. For some time I have been standing at the frontier where my work as Magister Ludi has become eternal recurrence, an empty exercise in formula. I have been doing it without joy, without enthusiasm, sometimes even without faith. It was time to stop." Alexander sighed. "That is your view, but not the view of the order and its rules. A brother in our order has moods, and at times he wearies of his work. There is nothing new and remarkable about that. The rules show him the way to regain harmony, to find his center again. Had you forgotten that? I do not think so, Your Reverence. My administration is open to your inspection, and only recently, after you had received my circular letter, you conducted an investigation of the player's village and of me personally. You learned that the work was being done, that secretariat and archive were in order, that the Magister Ludi showed no signs of illness or vagary. I was able to carry on, and sustain my strength and composure, because of those very rules which you so skillfully taught me. But it cost me great effort. And now, unfortunately, it is costing me almost as much effort to convince you that I am not giving in to moods, whims, or vague yearnings. But whether or not I succeed, I insist at least on your acknowledging that my personality and my work were sound and useful up to the moment you last evaluated them. Is that asking too much of you?" Master Alexander's eyes twinkled rather sardonically. "My dear colleague," he said, "you address me as if we were two private individuals holding a casual conversation. But that applies only to yourself. You are now in fact a private individual. I am not, and whatever I think and say, I do not speak for myself, but as president of the order, and he is responsible to his board for every word. What you are saying here today will remain without consequences. No matter how earnest your intentions, yours is the speech of a private person urging his own interests. But for me, my office and responsibility continue, and what I say or do today may have consequences. I shall plead your cause before the board. You want the board to accept your account of the circumstances, or perhaps even acknowledge that you have made a correct decision. Your case then is that until yesterday, though you may have had all sorts of weird ideas in your head, you were an irreproachable Castalian, an exemplary magister. That you may have experienced temptations, spells of weariness, but that you consistently fought and overcame them. Let us assume that I accept that, but then how am I to understand that the upright magister who only yesterday obeyed every rule today suddenly defects? You must admit this is more understandable in terms of a magister whose mind had in fact been impaired, who was suffering from psychic illness, so that he went on considering himself an excellent Castalian long after he had in reality ceased to be one. I also wonder why you make such a point of your having been a dutiful magister up to the very end. Since you have after all taken the step, broken your vow of obedience, and committed the act of desertion, why be concerned about establishing such a point?" Knecht protested. "I beg your pardon, Your Reverence, but why should I not be concerned about that? My name and reputation is involved, the memory I shall leave behind here. Also involved is the possibility of my working for Castalia on the outside. I am not here to salvage something for myself, or even to win the board's approval of my action. I counted on being regarded by my colleagues henceforth as a dubious phenomenon, and am prepared for that. But I don't want to be regarded as a traitor or madman. That is a verdict I cannot accept. I have done something you must disapprove of, but I have done it because I had to, because it was incumbent upon me, because that is my destiny, which I believe in and which I assume with good will. If you cannot concede this much, then I have been defeated and have spoken with you in vain. Again and again it comes down to the same thing, Alexander replied. You want me to concede that in some circumstances an individual has the right to break the laws in which I believe and which it is my task to represent. But I cannot simultaneously believe in our system and in your personal right to violate it. Please, don't interrupt me. I can concede that to all appearances you are convinced of the rightness and meaningfulness of your dreadful step, and that you believe you have been called to take such action. You certainly don't expect me to approve the step itself. On the other hand, you have achieved something, for I have given up my initial thought of winning you back and changing your decision. I accept your withdrawal from the order and shall pass on to the board the news of your voluntary resignation of your post. I cannot make any further concessions to you, Joseph necked. The Magister Ludi made a gesture of submission. Then he said quietly, "Thank you. I have already given you the casket. I now turn over to you, as representative of the board, my notes on the state of affairs in Waldsall, especially on the body of tutors and my recommendations on the persons I consider possible successors to my office." He took a few folded sheets of paper from his pocket and placed them on the table. Then he rose, and the president rose also. Neck took a step toward him, looked into his eyes for a long moment in sorrowful friendliness, then bowed and said, "I had wanted to ask you to shake hands with me in parting, but I suppose I must forego this now. You have always been especially dear to me, and today has not changed that in any way. Goodbye, dear and revered master." Alexander stood still. He was rather pale. For a moment it seemed as though he meant to extend his hand to the departing magister. He felt his eyes growing moist. Then he inclined his head, responded to Knecht's bow, and let him go. After Knecht had closed the door behind him, the president stood unmoving, listening to the departing footsteps. When the last one had faded away and there was nothing more to be heard, he walked back and forth across the room for a while, until footsteps again sounded outside and there was a soft knock at the door. The young servant entered and reported that a visitor wished to see him. "Tell him that I can receive him in an hour and that I request him to be brief. There are urgent matters to attend to." "No, wait a moment. Also go to the Secretariat and inform the first secretary to convoke a meeting of the entire board for the day after tomorrow. All members must attend. Only severe illness will be acceptable as an excuse for absence. Then go to the steward and tell him I must leave for Waldsall early tomorrow morning. Have my car ready by 7. "I beg your pardon," the young man said, "but the Magister Ludi's car is at your disposal." "How is that?" "His Reverence came by car yesterday. He has just left word that he is continuing his journey on foot and leaving the car here at your disposal." "Very well, I'll take the Waldsall car tomorrow." "Repeat, please." The servant repeated. "The visitor will be received in an hour. He is to be brief. The first secretary is to convoke the board for the day after tomorrow. Attendance mandatory, absence excused only on grounds of severe illness. Departure for Waldsall at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning in the Magister Ludi's car." Master Alexander took a deep breath once the young man had gone. He went over to the table where he had sat with Knecht. Still echoing in his ears were the footsteps of that incomprehensible man whom he had loved above all others and who had inflicted this great grief upon him. He had loved this man ever since the days he had first helped him, and among other traits it had been Knecht's way of walking that had appealed so strongly to him, a firm, rhythmic step that was also light, almost airy, expressing something between dignity and childlikeness, between priestliness and the dance, a strange, lovable, and elegant walk that accorded with Knecht's face and voice. It accorded equally well with his peculiar way of being a Castalian and magister, his kind of mastership and serenity, which sometimes reminded Alexander of the aristocratically measured manner of his predecessor, Master Thomas, sometimes of the simple, heartwarming former music master. So he had already left, in his haste, and on foot, who could say where, and probably he, Alexander, would never see him again, never again hear his laugh and watch the fine, long and slender fingers of his hand drawing the hieroglyphs of a glass bead game phrase. Alexander reached for the sheets of paper that had been left lying on the table and began reading them. They amounted to a brief testament, extremely terse and matter-of-fact, frequently consisting only of few words rather than sentences. Their purpose was to facilitate the board's work in the forthcoming investigation of the Vicus Lucerum and the appointment of a new magister. The laconic, sensible remarks stood there in neat, small letters, the words and handwriting just as uniquely and unmistakably typical of Joseph Knecht as his face, his voice, his gait. The board would scarcely find a man of his stature for his successor. Real masters and real personalities were all too rare, and each one was a matter of good luck and a pure gift, even here in Castalia, the province of the elite. Joseph Knecht enjoyed walking. It was years since he had last traveled on foot. In fact, when he reviewed the matter it seemed to him that his last real walking tour had been the one that had long ago taken him from Marioffel's monastery back to Castalia and to that annual game in Waldsall which had been so overshadowed by the death of Magister Thomas von der Trave and had resulted in his own appointment to succeed the Magister Ludi. Ordinarily, when he thought back upon those days, let alone upon his student years in the bamboo grove, it had always been as if he were gazing from a cool, dull room out into broad, brightly sunlit landscapes, into the irrevocable past, the paradise of memory. Such recollections had always been, even when they were free of sadness, a vision of things remote and different, separated from the prosaic present by a mysterious festiveness. But now, on this bright and cheerful September afternoon, with the strong greens and browns all around him and the ethereal, gently misted tones of blue verging into violet in the distance, as he trudged along at an easy pace, with frequent pauses to look about him, that walking tour of so long ago did not seem a distant paradise cut off from a resigned present. Rather, his present journey was the same as that of the past. The present Joseph Knecht was close as a brother to the Knecht of those days. Everything was new again, mysterious, promising, all that had been could recur, and many new things as well. It was long, long since he had looked out upon the day and the world and seen them as so unburdened, so beautiful and innocent. The happiness of freedom, of commanding his own destiny, flooded through him like a strong drink. How long it was since he had last had this feeling, last entertained this lovely and rapturous illusion. He pondered that, and recalled the time this precious feeling had first been bruised, then given a fatal blow. It had happened during a conversation with Magister Thomas, under the latter's friendly and ironic glance. He now recalled the strange sensation of that hour in which he had lost his freedom. It had not really been a pang, a burning anguish, but rather an onset of timidity, a faint shiver at the nape of his neck, an organic warning somewhere above his diaphragm, a change in the temperature and especially in the tempo of his consciousness of life. That anxious, constricting sensation, the hidden threat of suffocation of that fateful hour, was being recompensed now, or healed. The day before, during his drive to Hersland, Knecht had decided that whatever might happen there, he would not repine. Now he forbade himself to think over the details of his conversations with Alexander, of his struggle with him and his struggle to win him. He left himself entirely open to the feeling of relaxation and freedom that filled him like the approach of evening leisure for a peasant whose day's work lies behind him. He was conscious of being safe and under no obligations. For a moment he was utterly dispensable, exempt from all responsibilities, not required to perform any tasks, to do any thinking. The bright, varicolored day surrounded him with a gentle radiance, wholly visual, wholly present, imposing no demands, having neither yesterday nor tomorrow. Now and then as he walked he contentedly hummed one of the marching songs he and his schoolmates used to sing in 3 or 4 parts on outings, when he was an elite pupil at Eschholz, and out of that serene early morning of his life small bright memories and sounds came fluttering to him like the chirping of birds. Under a cherry tree with leaves already showing glints of purple he stopped to rest and sat down in the grass. He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a thing that Master Alexander would never have guessed he would be carrying, a small wooden flute, which he contemplated for a moment with tenderness. He had not owned this naive, childish-looking instrument for long, perhaps half a year, and he recalled with pleasure the day he had acquired it. He had ridden to Monteport to discuss some problems of musical theory with Carlo Ferramonte. Their conversation had turned to the woodwinds of certain ages, and he had asked his friend to show him the Monteport instrument collection. After an enjoyable stroll through several halls filled with old organ manuals, harps, lutes, and pianos, they had come to a building where instruments for the schools were stored. Their Knecht had seen a whole drawer full of such little flutes. He had examined and tried one, and asked his friend whether he might have one. Laughing, Carlo had invited him to choose. Still laughing, he had presented him with a receipt to sign, but then he had seriously explained the structure of the instrument, its fingering, and the technique of playing it. Knecht had taken the pretty little toy with him, and practiced on it occasionally, for he had not played a wind instrument since the recorder of his boyhood in Eschholz, and had often resolved to learn one again. In addition to scales, he had used a book of old melodies which Ferramonte had edited for beginners, and every so often the soft, sweet notes of the flute had sounded from the magister's garden or from his bedroom. He was far from a master of the instrument, but had learned to play a number of chorales and songs. He knew the music by heart, and also the words of a good many of them. One of these songs now sprang into his mind. It seemed highly suitable to the moment. He sang a few lines under his breath. My body and head lay asleep like the dead, but now I stand strong, gay as the day is long, and turn my face to heaven. He brought the instrument to his lips and blew the melody, looking out into the radiant plain that arched toward the distant mountains, listening to the serenely devout song ringing out in the sweet notes of the flute, and feeling at one in content with the sky, the mountains, the song, and the day. With pleasure, he felt the smooth wand between his fingers and reflected that aside from the clothes on his body this toy flute was the only piece of property he had allowed himself to take from Waldsall. In the course of years he had accumulated a good many things that could be more or less regarded as personal property, above all writings, notebooks, and so on. He had left all these things behind. The player's village might use them as it wished. But he had taken the flute, and he was glad to have it with him. It was a modest and lovable traveling companion. On the second day he arrived in the capital on foot and called at the Designori home. Plinio sped down the steps to meet him and embraced him with emotion. We have been longing for you, and anxiously waiting for you, he exclaimed. You have taken a great step, friend. May it bring good things to all of us. But to think that they let you go. I never would have believed it. Knecht laughed. You see, I am here. But I'll tell you about it by and by. But now I'd like to greet my pupil, and of course your wife, and discuss everything with you. How we are going to arrange my new position. I am eager to start on it. Plinio called a maid and told her to bring his son at once. The young gentleman? She asked, seemingly astonished, but hurried off while Plinio showed his friend to the guest room. He began eagerly describing what preparations he had made for Knecht's arrival, and how he imagined the tutoring of young Tito would work out. Everything had been arranged as Knecht wished it, he said. Tito's mother, after some initial reluctance, had also grasped the reasons for these wishes and assented to them. The family owned a vacation cottage in the mountains, called Belpunt, pleasantly situated on a lake. There Knecht would live with his pupil for the time being. An elderly servant would keep house for them. She had already left several days ago to put the place in order. Of course they could stay there only for a short time, at most till the onset of winter, but such isolation would certainly be beneficial, especially for the initial period. Fortunately, Tito loved the mountains and Belpunt, so the boy made no difficulties about going there. He was even looking forward to the project. At this point Designori remembered that he had an album of photos of the house and its environs. He drew Knecht along into his study, searched eagerly for the album, and when he had found it began showing his guest the house and describing the big farm kitchen living room, the tile stove, the arbors, the lake shore, the waterfall. Does it seem nice to you? He asked insistently. Will you feel comfortable there? Why not? Knecht said calmly. But I wonder where Tito is. It's been quite some time since he was sent for. They chatted for a while longer. Then they heard footsteps outside. The door opened, but neither Tito nor the maid dispatched for him entered. It was Tito's mother, Madame Designori. Knecht rose to greet her. She extended her hand, smiling with a somewhat artificial friendliness. He could see beneath this polite smile an expression of anxiety and vexation. She barely managed a few words of welcome and then turned to her husband and impetuously burst out with what was troubling her. It's really so awkward, she exclaimed. Imagine, the boy has vanished and is nowhere to be found. Oh well, I imagine he has gone out, Plinio said soothingly. He'll be along. Unfortunately that isn't likely, his wife said. He's been gone all day. I noticed his absence early this morning. And why am I only now being told about it? Because I naturally expected him back any minute and saw no reason to trouble you needlessly. At first I took it for granted that he had simply gone for a walk. When he didn't return by noon I began to worry. You were not lunching with us today or I would have spoken to you. Even then, I tried to persuade myself that it was simply carelessness on his part to make me wait so long. But it seems it wasn't that. Permit me a question, Knecht said. The young man knew I would be arriving soon, didn't he, and about your plans for him and me? Of course, Magister. And he seemed to be agreeable to those plans, or at least he preferred having you as his teacher to being sent back to some school. Oh well, Knecht said, then there is nothing to worry about. Your son is used to a great deal of freedom, Signora, especially of late. It's understandable that the prospect of a tutor and disciplinarian should be rather dreadful to him. And so he's made off at just the moment he was to be turned over to his new teacher, probably less with the hope of actually escaping his fate than with the thought that he'll lose nothing by postponement. Besides, he probably wanted to play a trick on his parents and the schoolmaster they found for him, and so show his defiance to the whole world of grown-ups and teachers. Designori was glad that Knecht took the incident so lightly. He himself was full of anxiety. With his intense love for his son, he imagined all sorts of dangers. Perhaps, he thought, the boy had run away in all earnest. Perhaps he even intended to do himself some harm. It seemed as if they were going to pay for all their faults of omission and commission in the boy's upbringing, just when they were hoping to remedy things. Against Knecht's advice, he insisted that something must be done. He could not take this latest crisis passively, and worked himself up to a pitch of impatience and nervous agitation which his friend found deplorable. It was therefore decided to send messages to the homes of a few of Tito's friends, where he sometimes stayed overnight. Knecht was relieved when Madame Designori left to attend to this, and he had Plinio to himself for a while. Plinio, he said, you look as if your son had just been carried dead into the house. He is no longer a small child and is not likely to have been run over or to have eaten deadly nightshade. So get a grip on yourself, my dear fellow. Since the boy isn't here, permit me for a moment to teach you something in his stead. I have been observing you and find that you're not in the best of form. The moment an athlete receives an unexpected blow or pressure, his muscles react of their own accord by making the necessary movements, stretching or contracting automatically and so helping him master the situation. You too, my pupil Plinio, the moment you received the blow, or what you exaggeratedly thought a blow, should have applied the first defensive measure against psychic assaults and resorted to slow, carefully controlled breathing. Instead, you breathe like an actor when he seeks to represent extreme emotion. You are not sufficiently armored. You people in the world seem to be singularly exposed to suffering and cares. There is something helpless and touching about your state, though often, when real suffering is involved and there is meaning to such pangs, it is also magnificent. But for everyday life these protective measures are most valuable and should not be ignored. I will make sure that your son will be better armed when he needs such equipment. And now, Plinio, be so kind as to do a few exercises with me, so that I can see whether you have really forgotten it all. With the breathing exercises, which he guided by strictly rhythmical commands, he was able to distract Plinio from his self-induced agonies until he was willing to listen to rational arguments and dismantle the structure of alarm and anxiety he had so lavishly built. They went up to Tito's room, where Necht looked benignly around at the confusion of boyish possessions. He picked up a book lying on the night table, saw a slip of paper jutting from it, and found it was a note from the vanished boy. Laughing, he handed the paper to Designori, whose expression immediately brightened. Tito had written that he was leaving at daybreak and going to the mountains alone, where he would wait at Belpunt for his new teacher. He hoped, the message said, that his parents would not mind his having this last little jaunt before his freedom was once more awfully restricted. His spirits sank when he thought of having to make this pleasant little journey accompanied by his teacher, a prisoner under supervision. Quite understandable, Necht commented. I'll leave for Belpunt tomorrow and will probably find the boy already there. But now you'd better go to your wife and tell her the news. For the rest of the day the atmosphere in the house was happy and relaxed. That evening, on Plinio's insistence, Necht summarized the events of the past several days, and in particular described his 2 conversations with Master Alexander. On that evening he also scribbled some curious lines of verse on a scrap of paper which is today in the possession of Tito Designori. That came about in the following way. Before dinner his host had left him alone for an hour. Necht saw a bookcase full of old books which aroused his curiosity. Idle reading was another pleasure which he had unlearned and almost forgotten in years of abstinence. This moment now reminded him intensely of his student years. To stand before a shelf of unknown books, reach out at random, and choose one or another volume whose gilt or author's name, format or the color of the binding, appealed to him. With pleasure he glanced over the titles on the spines and saw that the shelf consisted entirely of 19th and 20th century belles lettres. Finally he picked out a faded cloth-bound volume whose title, Wisdom of the Brahmins, tempted him. Standing for a while, then seated, he leafed through the book, which contained many hundreds of didactic poems. It was a curious composite of learned loquacity and real wisdom, of Philistinism and genuine poetry. This strange and touching book held, it seemed to him, a good deal of important esoteric philosophy, but this was almost lost in the heavy-handed treatment. The best poems were by no means the ones in which the poet tried hard to give form to a theory or a truth, but the ones in which the poet's temperament, his capacity for love, his sincerity, humanitarianism, and deep respectability, found expression. As Necht delved into the book, with mixed feelings of esteem and amusement, he was struck by a stanza which he absorbed with satisfaction and assent. Reading it, he nodded smilingly, as if it had been specially sent to him for this day in his life. It went, "Our days are precious but we gladly see them going. If in their place we find a thing more precious growing. A rare, exotic plant, our gardener's heart delighting. A child whom we are teaching, a booklet we are writing." He opened the drawer of the desk, found a sheet of paper, and copied out the stanza. Later he showed it to Plinio, and commented, "I like these lines. There is something special about them, they are so dry and at the same time so deeply felt. And they so well suit me in my momentary situation and mood. Although I am not a gardener and don't intend to devote my days to the cultivation of an exotic plant, I am a teacher, and am on the way to my task, to the child I mean to teach. How I am looking forward to it. As for the author of these lines, the poet Ruckert, I would suppose he possessed all 3 of these noble passions, that of gardener, teacher, and writer. I suppose the third ranked highest with him. He shapes the stanza so that it receives the maximum stress, and dotes so on the object of his passion that he becomes positively tender and calls it not a book, but a booklet. How touching that is." Plinio laughed. "Who knows," he observed, "whether the diminutive is not just a rhymester's trick because he needed a 2-syllable instead of a 1-syllable word there." "Let us not underestimate him," Necht replied. "A man who wrote tens of thousands of lines of verse in his lifetime would not be driven into a corner by shabby metrical necessity. No, just listen to it, how loving it sounds, and at the same time just a little sheepish. A booklet we are writing." Perhaps it isn't only his affection that transforms the book into a booklet. Perhaps he also meant it apologetically. Probably this poet was so devoted to his writing that now and again he felt his own passion for making books as a kind of vice. In that case the word booklet would have not only the sense of an endearment, but also a propitiating, disarming connotation, as when a gambler invites someone to a little game, or a drinker asks for just a drop. Well, these are speculations. In any case, I find myself in full agreement and sympathy with the poet about the child he wishes to teach and the booklet he wants to write. Because I am not only familiar with the passion for teaching, I'm also rather inclined to do a little scribbling too. And now that I have liberated myself from officialdom, I am much drawn to the idea of using my leisure and good spirits one of these days to write a book, or rather, a booklet, a little thing for friends and those who share my views. What about? Designori asked with curiosity. Oh, anything, the subject would not matter. It would only be a pretext for me to seclude myself and enjoy the happiness of having a great deal of leisure. The tone would be what mattered to me, a proper mean between the solemn and the intimate, earnestness and jest, a tone not of instruction, but of friendly communication and discourse on various things I think I have learned. I don't suppose the way this poet Friedrich Ruckert mixes instruction and thinking, information and casual talk, would be my way, and yet something about it appeals strongly to me. It is personal and yet not arbitrary, playful and yet submits to strict rules of form. I like that. Well, for the present I shall not enter upon the joys and problems of writing little books. I have to keep my mind on other tasks. But sometime later, I imagine, I might very well experience the joys of authorship, of the sort I foresee. An easygoing, but careful examination of things not just for my solitary pleasure, but always with a few good friends and readers in mind. Next morning Knecht set out for Belpunt. Designori had wanted to accompany him, but Knecht had firmly vetoed the idea, and when the father attempted to press it, had almost snapped at him. The boy will have enough to do coming to terms with this nuisance of a new teacher, he said curtly. To foist his father on him at the same time would scarcely help things. As he rode through the brisk September morning in the car Plinio had hired for him, his good humor of yesterday returned. He chatted frequently with the chauffeur, asking him to stop or drive slowly every so often when the landscape looked particularly attractive, and several times he played his little flute. It was a beautiful and exciting ride from the lowlands in which the capital lay toward the foothills and on into the high mountains. The journey also led from fading summer deeper into autumn. About noon the last great climb began, over sweeping serpentines, through thinning evergreen forest, past foaming mountain streams roaring between cliffs, over bridges and by solitary, massive walled farmhouses with tiny windows, into a stony, ever rougher and more austere world of mountains, amid whose bleakness and sobriety the flowering meadows bloomed like tiny paradises with doubled loveliness. The small cottage they reached at last was tucked away near a mountain lake, among gray cliffs with which it scarcely contrasted. The traveler was at once aware of the austerity, even the gloom, of this kind of building, which so accorded with the ruggedness of the mountains. But then a cheerful smile lighted his face, for in the open door of the house he saw a figure standing, a young man in a colorful jacket and shorts. It could only be his pupil Tito, and although he had not really been seriously concerned about the fugitive, he nevertheless breathed a grateful sigh of relief. If Tito were here and welcoming his teacher on the threshold, all was well. That disposed of a good many possible complications he had been considering during the ride. The boy came forward to meet him, smiling, friendly, and a little embarrassed. While helping Knecht out of the car, he said, "I didn't mean to be horrid, letting you travel alone." And before Knecht had a chance to reply, he added trustfully, "I think you understood my feeling. Otherwise you would have brought my father with you. I've already let him know that I arrived safely." Laughing, Knecht shook hands with the boy. He was guided into the house, where the servant welcomed him and promised that supper would soon be ready. Yielding to an unwanted need, he lay down for a little while before the meal, and only then realized that he was curiously tired, in fact exhausted, from the lovely automobile trip. During the evening, moreover, as he chatted with his pupil and looked at Tito's collections of mountain flowers and butterflies, his fatigue increased. He even felt something akin to giddiness, a kind of emptiness in the head that he had never experienced before, and an annoying weakness and irregularity of his heartbeat. But he continued to sit with Tito until their agreed bedtime, and took pains not to show any sign that he was not feeling well. Tito was somewhat surprised that the magister said not a word about the beginning of school, schedules, report cards, and similar matters. In fact, when he ventured to capitalize on this good mood and proposed a long walk for the morning, to acquaint his teacher with his new surroundings, the proposal was readily accepted. "I am looking forward to the walk," Knecht added, "and want to ask you a favor right now. While looking at your plant collection I could see that you know far more about mountain plants than I do. One of the purposes of our being together is, among other things, that we exchange knowledge and reach a balance with each other. Let us begin by your checking over my meager understanding of botany and helping me go further in this field." By the time they bade each other good night, Tito was in excellent spirits and had made some good resolutions. Once again he had found this Magister Knecht very much to his liking. Without using fancy language and going on about scholarship, virtue, the aristocracy of intellect, and so on, as his schoolteachers were prone to do, this serene, friendly man had something in his manner and his speech that imposed an obligation and brought out your good, chivalric, higher aspirations and forces. It could be fun, and sometimes you felt it as a badge of honor, to deceive and outwit the ordinary schoolmaster, but in the presence of this man such notions never even occurred to you. He was, why, what exactly was he like? Tito reflected on this, trying to determine what it was about this stranger that was so likable and at the same time so impressive. He decided that it was the man's nobility, his innate aristocratic quality. This was what drew him to Knecht, this above all. He was a nobleman, although no one knew his family and his father might have been a shoemaker. He was nobler and more aristocratic than most of the people Tito knew, more aristocratic than Tito's own father. The boy, who highly prized the patrician instincts and traditions of his house and could not forgive his father for having broken with them, was for the first time encountering intellectual aristocracy, cultivated nobility. Knecht was an example of that power which under favorable conditions can sometimes work miracles, overleaping a long succession of ancestors and within a single human life transforming a plebeian child into a member of the highest nobility. In the proud and fiery boy's heart there stirred an inkling that to belong to this kind of nobility, and to serve it, might be a duty and honor for him. That here perhaps, embodied in this teacher who for all his gentleness and friendliness was a nobleman through and through, the meaning of his own life was drawing near to him, that his own goals were being set. Knecht, after being shown to his room, did not lie down at once, although he craved rest. The evening had cost him a great effort. He had found it difficult to comport himself so that nothing in his expression, posture, or voice would reveal his peculiar fatigue or depression or illness to the young man, who was undoubtedly observing him closely. Still, he seemed to have succeeded. But now he had to meet and master this vacuity, this nausea, this alarming giddiness, this deathly tiredness which was at the same time restiveness. He could master it only if he recognized its cause. This was not hard to find, although it took him some time. The reason for his indisposition, he decided, was simply the journey which had taken him in so short a time from the lowlands to an altitude of close to 7,000 feet. Except for a few outings in his early youth, he was unaccustomed to such heights and had not reacted well to the rapid ascent. Probably this disability would last another day or two. If it did not disappear by then, he would have to return home with Tito and the housekeeper, in which case Plinio's plan for a stay in lovely Belpont would come to nothing. That would be a pity, but no great misfortune. After these reflections, he went to bed, and since sleep refused to come, spent the night partly in reviewing his travels since his departure from Waldsall, partly trying to quiet his heartbeat and his exacerbated nerves. He also thought a good deal about his pupil, with pleasure, but without making any plans. It seemed to him wiser to tame this noble but refractory colt by kindness and slow domestication. Nothing must be hasty or forced in this case. He thought that he would gradually bring the boy to an awareness of his gifts and powers, and at the same time nourish in him that noble curiosity, that aristocratic dissatisfaction from which springs love for the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. The task was a rewarding one, and his pupil was not just any talented young man whom he had to awaken and train. As the only son of a wealthy and influential patrician, he was also a future leader, one of the social and political shapers of the country and the nation, destined to command and to be imitated. Castalia had failed the Designori family. It had not educated Tito's father thoroughly enough, had not made him strong enough for his difficult position poised between the world and culture. As a result, gifted and charming young Plinio had become an unhappy man with a life out of balance and ill-managed. As a further result, his only son was endangered in his turn and had been drawn into his father's difficulties. Here was something to heal and make good, here was a debt to be paid. It seemed meaningful, and gladdened him, that this task should fall to him of all persons, to him the disobedient and seemingly apostate Castalian. In the morning, when he sensed the house awakening, he rose. Finding a dressing gown laid ready beside his bed, he put it on, and stepped out through the rear door that Tito had shown him the night before into the arcade that connected the house with the bath hut by the lake. Before him the little lake lay motionless, gray-green. Further off was a steep cliff, its sharp, jagged crest still in shadow, rearing sheer and cold into the thin, greenish, cool morning sky. But he could sense that the sun had already risen behind this crest. Tiny splinters of its light glittered here and there on corners of rock. In a few minutes the sun would appear over the crenellations of the mountain and flood lake and valley below with light. In a mood of earnest attentiveness, Knecht studied the scene, whose stillness, gravity, and beauty he felt as unfamiliar and nevertheless of deep concern and instructiveness to him. Now, even more strongly than during yesterday's ride, he felt the ponderousness, the coolness and dignified strangeness of this mountain world, which does not meet men halfway, does not invite them, scarcely tolerates them. And it seemed to him strange and significant that his first step into the freedom of life in the world should have led him to this very place, to this silent and cold grandeur. Tito appeared, in bathing trunks. He shook hands with the magister and pointing to the cliffs opposite said, "You've come at just the right moment. The sun will be rising in a minute." "Oh, it's glorious up here." Knecht gave him a friendly nod. He had learned long ago that Tito was an early riser, a runner, wrestler, and hiker, if only from protest against his father's casual, unsoldierly, comfort-loving ways. For the same reason he refused to drink wine. These leanings occasionally led him into a pose of being an anti-intellectual child of nature. The Designors seemed to have this bent for exaggeration. But Knecht welcomed it all, and was determined to share his interest in sports as a means for winning over and taming the temperamental young man. It would be only one means among several, and not at all the most important. Music, for example, would lead them much further. Of course he had no thought of matching the young man in physical feats, let alone surpassing him. But harmless participation would suffice to show the boy that his tutor was neither a coward nor a mere bookworm. Tito looked eagerly toward the dark crest of the mountain, behind which the sky pulsed in the morning light. Now a fragment of the rocky ridge flashed violently like a glowing metal beginning to melt. The crest blurred and seemed suddenly lower, as if it were melting down, and from the fiery gap the dazzling sun appeared. Simultaneously, the ground, the house, and their shore of the lake were illuminated, and the two, standing in the strong radiance, instantly felt the delightful warmth of this light. The boy, filled with the solemn beauty of the moment and the glorious sensation of his youth and strength, stretched his limbs with rhythmic arm movements, which his whole body soon took up, celebrating the break of day in an enthusiastic dance and expressing his deep oneness with the surging, radiant elements. His steps flew in joyous homage toward the victorious sun and reverently retreated from it. His outspread arms embraced mountain, lake, and sky. Kneeling, he seemed to pay tribute to the Earth Mother, and extending his hands to the waters of the lake, he offered himself, his youth, his freedom, his burning sense of his own life, like a festive sacrifice to the powers. The sunlight gleamed on his tanned shoulders, his eyes were half closed to the dazzle. his young face stared mask-like with an expression of inspired, almost fanatical gravity. The Magister, too, was overpowered by the solemn spectacle of dawn breaking in this silent, rocky solitude. But he was even more fascinated by the human spectacle taking place before his eyes, this ceremonial dance performed by his pupil to welcome the morning and the sun. The dance elevated this moody, immature youth, conferring upon him a priestly solemnity, suddenly in a single moment irradiating and revealing to the onlooker his deepest and noblest tendencies, gifts, and destinies just as the appearance of the sun opened and illuminated this cold, gloomy mountain dale. In this moment the young man seemed to him stronger and more impressive than he had hitherto thought, but also harder, more inaccessible, more remote from culture, more pagan. This ceremonial and sacrificial dance under the sign of Pan meant more than young Plinio's speeches and verse-making ever had. It raised the boy several stages higher, but also made him seem more alien, more elusive, less obedient to any summons. The boy himself was in the grip of his impulse, without knowing what was happening to him. He was not performing a dance he already knew, a dance he had practiced before. This was no familiar rite of celebrating sun and morning that he had long ago invented. Only later would he realize that his dance and his transported state in general were only partly caused by the mountain air, the sun, the dawn, his sense of freedom. They were also a response to the change awaiting him, the new chapter in his young life that had come in the friendly and awe-inspiring form of the Magister. In that morning hour many elements conspired in the soul of young Tito to shape his destiny and distinguish this hour above 1,000 others as a high, a festive, a consecrated time. Without knowing what he was doing, asking no questions, he obeyed the command of this ecstatic moment, danced his worship, prayed to the sun, professed with devout movements and gestures his joy, his faith in life, his piety and reverence, both proudly and submissively offered up in the dance his devout soul as a sacrifice to the sun and the gods, and no less to the man he admired and feared, the sage and musician, the master of the magic game who had come to him from mysterious realms, his future teacher and friend. All this, like the torrent of light from the sunrise, lasted only a few minutes. Stirred to the core, Knecht watched the wonderful show, in which his pupil before his eyes, changed and revealed himself, presenting himself in a new light, alien and entirely his equal. Both of them stood on the walk between house and hut, bathed in the radiance from the east and deeply shaken by their experience. Tito, having barely completed the last step of his dance, awoke from his ecstasy and stood still, like an animal surprised in solitary play, aware that he was not alone, that not only had he experienced and performed something unusual, but that he had also had a spectator. His first thought was how to extricate himself from the situation, which struck him now as somehow dangerous and shaming. He had to act vigorously and smash the magic of these strange moments, which had totally absorbed and overwhelmed him. His face, but a moment before an ageless, stern mask, assumed a childish and rather foolish expression, like that of a person awakened too abruptly from a deep sleep. His knees swayed slightly, he looked into his teacher's face with vapid astonishment, and in sudden haste, as though something very important had just occurred to him, something he had neglected, he stretched out his right arm and pointed toward the opposite shore of the lake, which along with half the lake's waters still lay in the great, rapidly contracting shadow of the cliff whose top had already been conquered by the brilliance of the dawn. "If we swim very fast," he called out with boyish impetuosity, "we can just reach the other shore before the sun." The words were barely uttered, the challenge to a swimming race with the sun barely issued, when Tito with a tremendous leap plunged headfirst into the lake, as if in his high spirits or his shyness he could not get away fast enough and obliterate all memory of the preceding ritual by intensified activity. The water splashed up and closed around him. A few moments later his head, shoulders, and arms reappeared and remained visible on the blue-green surface, swiftly moving away. Knecht had not, when he came out, had in mind to bathe or swim. Both air and water were much too cool, and after his night of semi-illness, swimming would probably do him little good. But now, in the beautiful sunlight, stirred by the scene he had just witnessed, and with his pupil urging him into the water in this comradely fashion, he found the venture less deterring. Above all he feared that the promise born in this morning hour would be blasted if he disappointed the boy by opposing cool, adult rationality to this invitation to a test of strength. It was true that his feeling of weakness and uncertainty, incurred by the rapid ascent into the mountains, warned him to be careful. But perhaps this indisposition could be soonest routed by forcing matters and meeting it head-on. The summons was stronger than the warning, his will stronger than his instinct. He quickly shed the light dressing gown, took a deep breath, and threw himself into the water at the same spot where his pupil had dived. The lake, fed by glacial waters so that even in the warmest days of summer one had to be inured to it, received him with an icy cold, slashing in its enmity. He had steeled himself for a thorough chilling, but not for this fierce cold which seemed to surround him with leaping flames and after a moment of fiery burning began to penetrate rapidly into him. After the dive he had risen quickly to the surface, caught sight of Tito swimming far ahead of him, felt bitterly assailed by this icy, wild, hostile element, but still believed he could lessen the distance, that he was engaging in the swimming race, was fighting for the boy's respect and comradeship, for his soul. When he was already fighting with death, who had thrown him and was now holding him in a wrestler's grip. Fighting with all his strength, Knecht held him off as long as his heart continued to beat. The young swimmer had looked back frequently and seen with satisfaction that the Magister had followed him into the water. Now he peered once again, no longer saw him, and became uneasy. He looked and called, then turned and swam rapidly back. He could not find him. Swimming and diving, he searched for the lost swimmer until his strength too began to give out in the bitter cold. Staggering, breathless, he reached land at last, saw the dressing gown lying on the shore, and picking it up began mechanically rubbing his body and limbs until the numbed skin warmed again. Stunned, he sat down in the sunlight and stared into the water, whose cool blue-green now blinked at him strangely empty, alien, and evil. He felt overpowered by perplexity and deep sorrow, for with the waning of his physical weakness, awareness and the terror of what had happened returned to him. Oh, he thought in grief and horror, now I am guilty of his death. And only now, when there was no longer need to save his pride or offer resistance, he felt, in shock and sorrow, how dear this man had already become to him. And since in spite of all rational objections he felt responsible for the master's death, there came over him, with a premonitory shudder of awe, a sense that this guilt would utterly change him in his life, and would demand much greater things of him than he had ever before demanded of himself. Joseph Connect's posthumous writings. The poems of Connect's student years. Lament. No permanence is ours, we are a wave that flows to fit whatever form it finds. Through day or night, cathedral or the cave, we pass forever, craving form that binds. Mold after mold we fill and never rest. We find no home where joy or grief runs deep. We move, we are the everlasting guest. No field nor plow is ours, we do not reap. What God would make of us remains unknown. He plays, we are the clay to his desire. Plastic and mute, we neither laugh nor groan. He needs, but never gives us to the fire. To stiffen into stone, to persevere. We long forever for the right to stay. But all that ever stays with us is fear. And we shall never rest upon our way. A compromise. The men of principled simplicity will have no traffic with our subtle doubt. The world is flat, they tell us, and they shout. The myth of depth is an absurdity. For if there were additional dimensions beside the good old pair we'll always cherish, how could a man live safely without tensions? How could he live and not expect to perish? In order peacefully to coexist, let us strike one dimension off our list. If they are right, those men of principle, and life in depth is so inimical, the third dimension is dispensable. But secretly we thirst, graceful as dancers arabesque and bow. Our lives appear serene and without stress. A gentle dance around pure nothingness, to which we sacrifice the here and now. Our dreams are lovely and our game is bright, so finely tuned, with many artful turns. But deep beneath the tranquil surface burns longing for blood, barbarity, and night. Freely our life revolves, and every breath is free as air, we live so playfully. But secretly we crave reality. Begetting, birth, and suffering, and death. Alphabets. From time to time we take our pen in hand, and scribble symbols on a blank white sheet. Their meaning is at everyone's command. It is a game whose rules are nice and neat. But if a savage or a moonman came, and found a page, a furrowed runic field, and curiously studied lines and frame, how strange would be the world that they revealed. A magic gallery of oddities. He would see A and B as man and beast, as moving tongues or arms or legs or eyes. Now slow, now rushing, all constraint released. Like prints of ravens' feet upon the snow, he'd hop about with them, fly to and fro, and see 1,000 worlds of might have been, hidden within the black and frozen symbols. Beneath the ornate strokes, the thick and thin, he'd see the way love burns and anguish trembles. He'd wonder, laugh, shake with fear and weep, because beyond this cipher's cross-barred keep, he'd see the world in all its aimless passion, diminished, dwarfed, and spellbound in the symbols, and rigorously marching prisoner fashion. He'd think, each sign all others so resembles, that love of life and death, or lust and anguish, are simply twins whom no one can distinguish, until at last the savage with a sound of mortal terror lights and stirs a fire, chants and beats his brow against the ground, and consecrates the writing to his pyre. Perhaps before his consciousness is drowned in slumber there will come to him some sense of how this world of magic fraudulence, this horror utterly behind endurance, has vanished as if it had never been. He'll sigh and smile and feel all right again, on reading an old philosopher. These noble thoughts beguiled us yesterday. We savored them like choicest vintage wines. But now they sour, meanings seep away, much like a page of music from whose vines the clefs and sharps are carelessly erased. Take from a house the center of gravity. It sways and falls apart, all sense debased. Cacophony what had been harmony. So too a face we saw as old and wise, loved and respected, can wrinkle, craze. As, ripe for death, the mind deserts the eyes, leaving a pitiful, empty, shriveled maze. So too can ecstasy stir every sense, and barely felt can quickly turn to gall, as if there dwelt within us cognizance that everything must wither, die, and fall. Yet still above this veil of endless dying, man's spirit, struggling incorruptibly, painfully raises beacons, death defying, and wins, by longing, immortality. The last glass bead game player, The colored beads, his playthings, in his hand. He sits head bent, around him lies a land, laid waste by war and ravaged by disease. Growing on rubble, ivy hums with bees. A weary peace with muted psalmody sounds in a world of aged tranquility. The old man tallies up his colored beads. He fits a blue one here, a white one there, makes sure a large one or a small, proceeds, and shapes his game ring with devoted care. Time was he had won greatness in the game, had mastered many tongues and many arts, had known the world, traveled in foreign parts. From pole to pole, no limits to his fame. Around him pupils, colleagues always pressed. Now he is old, worn out, his life is lees. Disciples come no longer to be blessed, nor masters to invite an argument. All are gone, and the temples, libraries, and schools of Castalia are no more. At rest, amid the ruins, the glass beads in his hand. Those hieroglyphs once so significant, that now are only colored bits of glass. He lets them roll until their force is spent, and silently they vanish in the sand. Toccata by Bach, frozen silence, darkness prevails on darkness. One shaft of light breaks through the jagged clouds, coming from nothingness to penetrate the depths. Compound the night with day, build length and breadth. Prefigure peak and ridge, declivities, redoubts. A loose blue atmosphere, earth's deep dense fullness. That brilliant shaft dissevers teeming generation into both deed and war, and in a frenzy of creation ignites a gleaming terrified new world. All changes where the seeds of light descend. Order arises, magnificence is heard. In praise of life, of victory to light's great end. The mighty urge glides on, to move its power into all creatures' being, recalling far divinity, the spirit of God's doing. Now joy and pain, words, art, and song. World towering on world in arching victory throng. With impulse, mind, contention, pleasure, love. Translated by Alex Page. A dream. Guest at a monastery in the hills. I stepped, when all the monks had gone to pray, into a book-lined room. Along the walls, glittering in the light of fading day, I saw a multitude of vellum spines, with marvelous inscriptions. Eagerly, impelled by rapturous curiosity, I picked the nearest book and read the lines. The squaring of the circle, final stage. I thought, I'll take this and read every page. A quarto volume, leather tooled in gold, gave promise of a story still untold. How Adam also ate of the other tree. The other tree? Which one? The tree of life? Is Adam then immortal? Now I could see. No chance had brought me to this library. I spied the back and edges of a folio, aglow with all the colors of the rainbow. Its hand-painted title stating a decree. The interrelationships of hues and sound. Proof that for every color may be found in music a proper corresponding key. Choirs of colors sparkled before my eyes. And now I was beginning to surmise. Here was the library of paradise. To all the questions that had driven me, all answers now could be given me. Here I could quench my thirst to understand. For here all knowledge stood at my command. There was provision here for every need. A title full of promise on each book responded to my every rapid look. Here there was fruit to satisfy the greed of any student's timid aspirations, of any master's bold investigations. Here was the inner meaning, here the key to poetry, to wisdom, and to science. Magic and erudition in alliance opened the door to every mystery. These books provided pledges of all power to him who came here at this magic hour. A lectern stood nearby, with hands that shook. I placed upon it one enticing book, deciphered at a glance the picture writing. As in a dream we find ourselves reciting a poem or lesson we have never learned. At once I soared aloft to starry spaces of the soul, and with the zodiac turned, where all the revelations of all races, whatever intuition has divined, millennial experience of all nations, harmoniously met in new relations, old insights with new symbols recombined, so that in minutes or in hours as I read, I traced once more the whole path of mankind, and all that men have ever done and said, disclosed its inner meaning to my mind. I read, and saw those hieroglyphic forms couple and part, and coalesce in swarms, dance for a while together, separate, once more in newer patterns integrate, a kaleidoscope of endless metaphors, and each some vaster, fresher sense explores. Bedazzled by these sights, I looked away from the book to give my eyes a moment's rest, and saw that I was not the only guest. An old man stood before that grand array of tomes. Perhaps he was the archivist. I saw that he was earnestly intent upon some task, and I could not resist a strange conviction that I had to know the manner of his work and what it meant. I watched the old man, with frail hand and slow, remove a volume and inspect what stood written upon its back, then saw him blow with pallid lips upon the title. Could a title possibly be more alluring, or offer greater promise of enduring delight? But now his finger wiped across the spine. I saw it silently erase the name, and watched with fearful sense of loss as he inscribed another in its place. And then moved on to smilingly efface one more, but only a newer title to emboss. For a long while I looked at him bemused. Then turned, since reason totally refused to understand the meaning of his actions. Back to my book. I'd seen but a few lines, and found I could no longer read the signs, or even see the rows of images. The world of symbols I had barely entered. That had stirred me to such transports of bliss, in which a universe of meaning centered, seemed to dissolve and rush away, careen, and reel and shake in feverish contractions, and fade out, leaving nothing to be seen but empty parchment with a hoary sheen. I felt a hand upon me, felt it slide over my shoulder. The old man stood beside my lectern, and I shuddered while he took my book and with a subtle smile brushed his finger lightly to elide the former title, then began to write new promises and problems, novel inquiries, new formulas for ancient mysteries. Without a word, he plied his magic style. Then, with my book, he disappeared from sight. Worship. In the beginning was the rule of sacred kings, who hallowed field, grain, plow, who handed down the law of sacrifices, set the bounds to mortal men forever hungering for the invisible one's just ordinance, that holds the sun and moon in perfect balance, and whose forms in their eternal radiance feel no suffering nor no death's ambience. Long ago the sons of the gods, the sacred line, passed, and mankind remained alone, embroiled in pleasure and pain, cut off from being, condemned to change, unhallowed, unconfined. But intimations of the true life never died, and it is for us, in this time of harm, to keep, in metaphor and symbol and in psalm, reminders of that former sacred reverence. Perhaps someday the darkness will be banned. Perhaps someday the times will turn about. The sun will once more rule us as our God, and take the sacrifices from our hands. Soap bubbles. From years of study and of contemplation, an old man brews a work of clarity, a gay and involuted dissertation, discoursing on sweet wisdom playfully. An eager student bent on storming heights has delved in archives and in libraries, but adds the touch of genius when he writes a first book full of deepest subtleties. A boy, with bowl and straw, sits and blows, filling with breath the bubbles from the bowl. Each praises like a hymn, and each one glows. Into the filmy beads he blows his soul. Old man, student, boy, all these three, out of the Maya foam of the universe, create illusions. None is better or worse, but in each of them the light of eternity sees its reflection and burns more joyfully. After dipping into the Summa contra Gentiles, to truth, it seems to us, life once was nearer. The world ordered, intelligences clearer. Wisdom and knowledge were not yet divided. They lived far more serenely, many-sided. Those ancients of whom Plato, the Chinese, relate their incandescent verities. Whenever we entered the temple of Aquinas, the graceful Summa contra Gentiles, a new world greeted us, sweet, mature. A world of truth clarified and pure. There all seemed lucid, nature charged with mind, man moving from God to him as he designed. The law, in one great formulary bound, forming a whole, a still unbroken round. But we who belong to his posterity seem condemned to doubt and irony, to journeys in the wilderness, to strife, obsessions, and longings for a better life. But if our children's children undergo such sufferings as ours, they will bestow praise upon us as blessed and as wise. We will appear transfigured in their eyes, for out of our lives' harsh cacophonies, they will hear only fading harmonies, the legends of an anguish often told, the echoes of contentions long grown cold. And those of us who trust ourselves the least, who doubt and question most, these, it may be, will make their mark upon eternity, and youth will turn to them as to a feast. The time may come when a man who confessed his self-doubts will be ranked among the blessed, who never suffered anguish or knew fear, whose times were times of glory and good cheer, who lived like children, simple happy lives. For in us too is part of that eternal mind, which through the eons calls to brothers of its kind. Both you and I will pass, but it survives stages. As every flower fades and as all youth departs, so life at every stage, so every virtue, so our grasp of truth, blooms in its day and may not last forever, since life may summon us at every age. Be ready, heart, for parting, new endeavor. Be ready bravely and without remorse, to find new light that old ties cannot give. In all beginnings dwells a magic force, for guarding us and helping us to live. Serenely let us move to distant places, and let no sentiments of home detain us. The cosmic spirit seeks not to restrain us, but lifts us stage by stage to wider spaces. If we accept a home of our own making, familiar habit makes for indolence. We must prepare for parting and leave taking, or else remain the slaves of permanence. Even the hour of our death may send us speeding on to fresh and newer spaces, and life may summon us to newer races. So be it, heart, bid farewell without end. The glass bead game. We reenact with reverent attention the universal chord, the Master's harmony, evoking in unsullied communion minds and times of highest sanctity. We draw upon the iconography, whose mystery is able to contain the boundlessness, the storm of all existence. Give chaos form, and hold our lives in reign. The pattern sings like crystal constellations. And when we tell our beads, we serve the whole, and cannot be dislodged or misdirected. Held in the orbit of the cosmic soul. The three lives. 1. The Rainmaker. It was many thousands of years ago when women ruled. In tribe and family, mothers and grandmothers were revered and obeyed. Much more was made of the birth of a girl than of a boy. There was an ancestress in the village, 100 or more years ago, whom everyone revered and feared as if she were a queen, although in the memory of man she had seldom lifted a finger or spoken a word. Many a day she sat by the entrance to her hut, a retinue of ministering kinsfolk around her, and the women of the village came to pay their respects, to tell her their affairs, to show her their children and ask her blessing on them. The pregnant women came to ask her to touch their bellies and name the expected child. Sometimes the tribal mother would give the touch, sometimes she only nodded or shook her head, or else remained motionless. She rarely said anything, she was merely there, sitting and ruling, sitting with her yellowish-white hair falling in thin strands around her leathery, far-sighted eagle's face, sitting and receiving veneration, presents, requests, news, reports, accusations, sitting and known to all as the mother of 7 daughters, and the grandmother and ancestor of many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sitting and holding in those wrinkled features and back of that brown forehead the wisdom, the tradition, the law, the morality, and the honor of the village. It was a spring evening, overcast, the darkness falling early. The ancient herself was not sitting in front of the mud hut. In her stead was her daughter, almost as white-haired and stately and not much younger. She sat and rested. Her seat was the threshold, a flat field stone, covered with a skin in cold weather. At a little distance from her a few children, women, and boys squatted in a semicircle in the sand or grass. They squatted here every evening that it was not raining or too cold, for they wanted to hear the ancient's daughter tell stories or sing spells. Formerly, the ancient herself had done this, but now that she was too old and no longer communicative, her daughter took her place. Just as she had learned all the stories and spells from the old woman, so she also had her voice, her figure, the quiet dignity of her bearing, her movements, and her language. The younger listeners knew her much better than her mother and by now scarcely realized that she sat here in another's place passing on the tales and wisdom of the tribe. The wellspring of knowledge flowed from her lips on these evenings. She preserved the tribe's treasure under her white hair. Behind her gently furrowed old brow dwelt the memory and the mind of the village. Anyone who knew any spells or stories had learned them from her. Aside from her and the ancient, there was only one other guardian of knowledge in the tribe, but he remained hidden most of the time. A mysterious and extremely silent man. The Rainmaker, or as he was also called, the Weathermaker. Crouching among the listeners was also the boy Necht, and beside him a little girl named Ada. He was fond of this girl, often played with her and protected her, not out of love, for he knew nothing of that as yet, was still too much a child, but because she was the Rainmaker's daughter. Necht adored the Rainmaker. Next to the ancient and her daughter he admired no one so strongly as the Rainmaker. But the others were women. You could venerate and fear them, but you could not conceive the thought, could not possibly cherish the wish to become what they were. The Rainmaker was a rather unapproachable man. It was not easy for a boy to stay near him. That had to be managed in roundabout ways, and one of these roundabout ways to the Rainmaker was Necht's concern for his child. As often as possible he went to the Rainmaker's somewhat isolated hut to fetch her. Then he would sit with her listening to the old woman's tales, and later take her home. He had done this today, and now he was squatting beside her in the dark group, listening. Today the old woman was telling about the witch's village. Sometimes there is a wicked woman in a village who wishes harm to everyone. Usually these women conceive no children. Sometimes one of these women is so wicked that the village will no longer let her stay. Then the villagers go to her hut at night, her husband is fettered, and the woman is beaten with switches and driven far out into the woods and swamps. She is cursed with a curse and left there. Soon the husband's fetters are removed, and if he is not too old, he can take himself another wife. But if the expelled woman does not die, she wanders about in the woods and swamps, learns the language of animals, and when she has roamed long enough, sooner or later she finds her way to a small village that is called the witch's village. There all the wicked women who have been driven from their villages have come together and made a village of their own. There they live, do their wickedness, and make magic. But especially, because they have no children of their own, they like to coax children from the proper villages, and when a child is lost in the woods and never seen again, it may not have drowned in the swamp or been eaten by a wolf, but led astray by a witch and taken to the witch's village. In the days when I was still little and my grandmother was the eldest in the village, a girl once went to pick bilberries with the others, and while she was picking she grew tired and fell asleep. She was small. The ferns hid her from sight, and the other children moved on and did not notice until they were back in the village and it was already evening. Then they saw that the girl was no longer with them. The young men were sent out. They searched and called in the woods until night fell, and then they came back and had not found her. But the little girl, after she had slept enough, went on and on in the woods. And the more frightened she became, the faster she ran, but she no longer had any idea where she was and only ran farther away from the village, deeper and deeper into wild country. Around her neck, on a strip of bast, she wore a boar's tooth that her father had given her. He had brought it back from the hunt, and with a stone tool bored a hole through the tooth so that the bast could be drawn through it, and before that he had boiled the tooth 3 times in boar's blood and sung good spells, and anyone who wore such a tooth was protected against many kinds of magic. Now a woman appeared from among the trees. She was a witch. She put on a kindly face and said, "Greetings, pretty child, have you lost your way? Come along with me, I'll take you home." The child went along. But she remembered what her mother and father had told her, that she should never let a stranger see the boar's tooth, and so while she walked she slipped the tooth off the strip of bast and tucked it into her belt without being noticed. The woman walked for hours with the girl. It was already night when they reached the village, but it was not our village, it was the witch's village. There the girl was locked up in a dark stable, but the witch went to sleep in her hut. In the morning the witch said, "Don't you have a boar's tooth with you?" The child said no, she had had one, but she had lost it in the woods, and she showed her necklace with the tooth missing from it. Then the witch took a clay pot filled with earth, and 3 plants were growing in the earth. The child looked at the plants and asked what they were. The witch pointed to the first plant and said, "That is your mother's life." Then she pointed to the second and said, "That is your father's life." Then she pointed to the third plant, and that is your own life. As long as the plants are green and growing, you are all alive and well. If one withers, then the one whose life it is falls sick. If one is pulled out, as I am going to pull one out now, then the one whose life it is will surely die. She took hold of the plant that meant the father's life and began tugging at it, and when she had pulled it out a little so that a piece of the white root could be seen, the plant gave a deep sigh. At these words the little girl beside Necht sprang to her feet as if she had been bitten by a snake, screamed, and ran headlong away. She had been sitting for a long time fighting back the terror caused by the story, until she could no longer endure it. One old woman laughed. Other listeners were almost as frightened as the little girl, but they controlled themselves and remained seated. But Necht, startled out of his trance of fear, also sprang up and ran after the girl. The old woman went on with her story. The rainmaker had his hut close by the village pond, and Necht looked for the runaway in this direction. He searched and tried to lure her out of hiding with coaxing, reassuring hums, and sing-songs and clucks, using the voice that women used to call chickens, sweet, long drawn-out notes, intent on enchantment. "Ada," he called and sang. "Ada, little Ada, come here, Ada, here I am, Necht." He sang again, and before he had heard a sound from her or caught a glimpse of her he suddenly felt her small soft hand force its way into his. She had been standing by the path, pressed against the wall of the hut, and been waiting for him since hearing his first call. With a sigh of relief she moved close to him. He seemed to her as tall and strong as a man. "Were you frightened?" he asked. "You shouldn't be, no one will hurt you, everyone likes Ada. Come, we'll go home." She was still trembling and sobbing a little, but was already calmer, and went gratefully and trustfully along with him. Dim red light filtered through the doorway of the hut. Inside, the rainmaker sat stooped by the hearth. Yellow and red light gleamed through his flowing hair. The hearth fire was lit and he was boiling something in 2 small pots. Before entering with Ada, Necht watched curiously from outside for a few moments. He could see at once that whatever was being boiled was not food, that was done in different pots, and besides it was already much too late to prepare a meal. But the rainmaker had already heard him. "Who is standing at the door?" he called out. "Step forward, come in. Is it you, Ada?" He placed lids on his pots, raked glowing embers up against them, and turned around. Necht was still peering at the mysterious little pots. He felt curiosity, awe, and a sense of oppression all at once, as he always did whenever he entered this hut. He came here as often as he could, made up all sorts of pretexts for coming, but once he was here he always felt this half-thrilling, half-warning sensation of slight uneasiness, of eager curiosity and pleasure warring with fear. The old man knew that Necht had long been trailing after him, turning up as he did at odd moments in unlikely places. The boy was pursuing him like a hunter following a spoor, and mutely offering his services in his company. Turu, the rainmaker, looked at him with his bright hawk's eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked coolly. "This is no time of day for visits to strange huts, my boy." "I've brought Ada home, Master Turu." She was listening to the mother tell stories about witches and all of a sudden she was so frightened she screamed, so I walked her home. The rainmaker turned to his daughter. "You're too timid, Ada. Sensible little girls need not fear witches. You're a sensible little girl, aren't you?" "Yes, but the witches know all sorts of wicked tricks, and if you don't have a boar's tooth." "I see, you'd like to have a boar's tooth. All right, but I know something even better, a special root I'll give you. We'll look for it in the autumn. It protects sensible girls from all kinds of magic and even makes them prettier." Ada smiled happily. She was already reassured, now that the smell of the hut and the familiar firelight surrounded her. Shyly, Necht asked, "Couldn't I help look for the root? If you would only describe the plant to me." Turu's eyes narrowed. "A good many little boys would like to know that," he said, but his voice did not sound angry, only slightly mocking. "There's time for that, perhaps in the autumn." Necht slipped away and went to the youth house where he slept. He had no parents, he was an orphan. For that reason, too, he was entranced by Ada and her hut. Turu the Rainmaker was not fond of words. He did not like to hear himself or others talking. Many tribesmen thought him peculiar and some sullen. But he was neither. He knew what was going on around him, or at any rate knew more than anyone would have expected in a man seemingly so solitary, absent-minded and full of learning. Among other things, he knew quite well that this somewhat bothersome but handsome and evidently clever boy was running after him and observing him. He had noticed this as soon as it began, for it had been going on a year or longer now. He knew, too, exactly what it meant. It meant a great deal for the boy's future, and also meant a great deal for him, the Rainmaker. It meant that this boy had fallen in love with rainmaking and was longing to learn the art. Every so often there would be such boys in the village, and they would begin to hang about him, much as this boy was doing. Some could easily be discouraged and frightened away, others not, and he had taken on 2 of them as his disciples and apprentices. Both had married into other villages far away and were the rainmakers or simples gatherers there. Since then, Turu had been alone, and if he ever again took another apprentice, it would be to train him as his own successor. That was how it had always been, that was how it ought to be, and it could be no other way. A gifted boy always had to turn up and attach himself to the man whom he saw as the master of his craft. Necht was talented, he had what was needed, and he also had several signs to commend him. Above all, the look in his eyes, at once piercing and dreamy, the reserve and quiet in his manner, and in the expression of his face and the carriage of his head something questing, scenting, and alert, and attentiveness to noises and smells. There was something of the hawk and something of the hunter about him. Surely this boy could become a weathermaker, perhaps a magician also. He could be taught, but there was no hurry. The boy was still too young, and there was no reason to show him that he had been recognized. Apprenticeship must not be made too easy for him, he must go the whole way himself. If he could be intimidated, deterred, shaken off, discouraged, he would be no great loss. Let him wait and serve, let him creep around and pay court. Necht sauntered through the gathering night, under a cloudy sky with 2 or 3 stars. He made his way into the village, content and happily excited. This village knew nothing of the luxuries, beauties, and refinements which we today take for granted and which even the poorest among us regard as indispensable. The village had no culture and no arts. Its only buildings were the crooked mud huts. It knew nothing of iron and steel tools. Even wheat and wine were unknown. Inventions such as candles or lamps would have seemed dazzling wonders to these people. But Knecht's life and the world of his imagination were no poorer on that account. The world surrounded him like a picture book full of inexhaustible mysteries. Every day he conquered another little piece of it, from the animal and plant life to the starry sky, and between mute, mysterious nature and the breathing soul in his solitary, nervous boyish frame there dwelt all the kinship and all the tension, anxiety, curiosity, and craving for understanding of which the human soul is capable. Although there was no written knowledge in his world, no history, no books, no alphabets, and although everything that lay more than 3 or 4 hours' walk beyond his village was totally unknown and unreachable, he nevertheless lived fully and completely in his village, in the things that were his. The village, home, the community of the tribe under the guidance of the mothers gave him everything that nation and state can give to man. A soil filled with thousands of roots among whose intricate network he himself was a fiber, sharing in the life of all. Contentedly, he sauntered along. The night wind whispered in the trees. Branches creaked. There were smells of moist earth, of reeds and mud, of the smoke of wood still partly green, an oily and sweetish smell that meant home more than any other. And finally, as he approached the youth hut, there was its smell, the smell of boys, of young men's bodies. Noiselessly, he ducked under the reed mat, into the warm, breathing darkness. He settled into the straw and thought about the story of the witches, the boar's tooth, Ada, the rainmaker and his little pots in the fire, until he fell asleep. Turu only grudgingly yielded to the boy's importunity, he did not make it easy for him. But the youth was always on his trail. Something drew him to the old man, though he himself often did not know what it was. Sometimes, when the rainmaker was off somewhere in a remote spot in the woods, swamp, or heath, setting a trap, sniffing the spoor of an animal, digging a root, or collecting seeds, he would suddenly feel the boy's eyes upon him. Invisible, making no sound, Necht had been following him for hours, watching his every move. Sometimes the rainmaker would pretend not to notice, sometimes he growled and ungraciously ordered the boy to make himself scarce. But sometimes he would beckon him and let him stay for the day, would assign him tasks, show him one thing and another, give him advice, set tests for him, tell him the names of plants, order him to draw water or kindle fires. For each of these procedures he knew special tricks, knacks, secrets, and formulas which must, he impressed this on the boy, be kept strictly secret. And finally, when Necht was somewhat older, he took him from the youth house into his own hut, thus acknowledging the boy as his apprentice. By that act Necht was distinguished before all the people. He was no longer one boy among others, he was the rainmaker's apprentice, and that meant that if he bore up and amounted to something, he would be the next rainmaker. From the moment the old man took Necht into his hut, the barriers between them dropped, not the barrier of veneration and obedience, but of distrust and constraint. Turu had submitted, he had allowed Necht to conquer him by tenacious courtship. Now he wanted nothing more than to make a good rainmaker and successor of the boy. In this course of instruction there were no concepts, doctrines, methods, script, figures, and only very few words. The master trained Connect's senses far more than his intellect. A great heritage of tradition and experience, the sum total of man's knowledge of nature at that era, had to be administered, employed, and even more, passed on. A vast and dense system of experiences, observations, instincts, and habits of investigation was slowly and hazily laid bare to the boy. Scarcely any of it was put into concepts. Virtually all of it had to be grasped, learned, tested with the senses. The basis and heart of this science was knowledge of the moon, of its phases and effects as it waxed and waned, peopled by the souls of the dead whom it sent forth into new births in order to make room for the newly dead. Like that evening when he had escorted the frightened Ada to her father's hearth, another time was deeply etched on Connect's memory. This was a time when the master woke him 2 hours after midnight and went out with him in deep darkness to show him the last rising of a vanishing crescent moon. The master in motionless silence, the boy somewhat tremulous, shivering from lack of sleep, they waited a long time on a ledge of rock in the midst of the forested hills, watching the spot indicated by the master, until the thin, gently curving line of the moon appeared in the very position and shape he had described beforehand. Fearful and fascinated, Knecht stared at the slowly rising heavenly body. Gently it floated between dark banks of clouds in an island of clear sky. Soon it will change its shape and wax again, then will come the time to sow the buckwheat, the rainmaker said, counting out the days on his fingers. Then he lapsed into silence again. Knecht crouched as if he were alone on the rock gleaming with dew. He trembled with cold. From the depths of the forest came the long-drawn call of an owl. The old man pondered for a long while. Then he rose, placed his hand on Connect's hair, and said softly, as if awakening from a dream, "When I die, my spirit will fly into the moon. By then you will be a man and need a wife. My daughter Ada will be your wife. When she has a son by you, my spirit will return and dwell in your son, and you will call him Turu, as I am called Turu." The apprentice heard all this in astonishment. He did not dare say a word. The thin silvery sickle rose and was already half devoured by the clouds. A strange tremor passed through the young man, an intimation of many links and associations, repetitions and crosscurrents among things and events. He felt strangely poised both as spectator and participant against this alien night sky where the thin, sharp crescent, precisely predicted by the master, had appeared above endless woods and hills. How wonderful the master seemed, and veiled in 1,000 secrets, he who could think of his own death, whose spirit would live in the moon and return from the moon back into a person who would be Connect's son and bear the former master's name. The future, the fate before him, seemed strangely torn asunder, in places transparent as the cloudy sky, and the fact that anyone could know it, define it, and speak of it seemed to throw open a view into incalculable spaces, full of wonders and yet also full of orderliness. For a moment it seemed to him that the mind could grasp everything, know everything, hear the secrets of everything, the soft, sure course of the planets above, the life of man and animals, their bonds and hostilities, meetings and struggles, everything great and small along with the death locked within each living being. He saw or felt all this as a whole in a first shudder of premonition, and himself fitted into it, included within it as a part of the orderliness, governed by laws accessible to the mind. This first inkling of the great mysteries, their dignity in death as well as their nobility, came to the young man in the coolness of the forest as night moved toward morning and he crouched on the rock above the multitude of whispering treetops. It came to him, touched him like a ghostly hand. He could not speak of it, not then and never in his whole life, but he could not help thinking of it many times. In all his further learning and experiencing, the intensity of this hour was present in his mind. Think of it, it reminded him, think that all this exists, that there are rays and currents between the moon and you and Turu and Ada, that there is death in the land of the souls and a returning therefrom, and that in your heart there is an answer to all the things and sights of the world, that everything concerns you, that you ought to know as much about everything as it is possible for man to know. Something like this was what the voice said. For Knecht, this was the first time he heard the inner voice speaking thus, heard the seductive and imperative bidding of man's spirit. He had seen many a moon wander across the sky and heard many a nocturnal owl shrieking, and laconic though the master was, he had heard many a word of ancient wisdom or of solitary reflection from his lips, but at this moment something new and different had struck him. Presentiment of wholeness, the feeling for connections and relations, for the order that included him and gave him a share in the responsibility for everything. If you had the key to that, you did not need to depend on footprints to recognize an animal, or roots or seeds to know a plant. You would be able to grasp the whole world, stars, spirits, men, animals, medicines, and poisons, to grasp everything in its wholeness and to discern, in every part and sign, every other part. There were good hunters who could read more than others in a track, in fumets, a patch of fur and remains. They could say from a few tiny hairs not only what kind of animal these came from, but also whether it was old or young, male or female. From the shape of a cloud, a smell in the air, the peculiar behavior of animals or plants, others could foretell the weather for days in advance. His master was unsurpassed in this art, and nearly infallible. Still others had an inborn skill. There were boys who could hit a bird with a stone at 30 paces. They had not learned it, they could simply do it, it did not come by effort, but by magic or grace. The stone in their hand flew off by itself. The stone wanted to hit and the bird wanted to be hit. There were said to be others who knew the future, whether a sick man would live or die, whether a pregnant woman would give birth to a boy or a girl. The tribal mother's daughter was famous for this, and the rainmaker too was said to possess some of this knowledge. There must, it seemed to Necht at this moment, be a center in the vast net of associations. If you were at this center you could know everything, could see all that had been and all that was to come. Knowledge must pour in upon one who stood at this center as water ran to the valley and the hare to the cabbage. His word would strike sharply and infallibly as the stone in the sharpshooter's hand. By virtue of the mind's power he would unite all these wonderful gifts and abilities within himself, and use them at will. He would be the perfect, wise, insurpassable man. To become like him, to draw nearer to him, to be on the way to him. That was the way of ways, that was the goal, that gave sacredness and meaning to a life. Something like this was the way he felt, and our attempts to speak of it in our conceptual language, which he could never know, convey nothing of the awe and the passion of his experience. Rising at night, being led through the dark, still woods full of dangers and mysteries, waiting on the ledge in the chill of night and early morning, the appearance of the thin phantom of a moon, the wise master's few words, being alone with the master at so extraordinary an hour. All this was experienced and preserved by Necht as a solemn mystery, as a solemn initiation, as his admission into a league and a cult, into a humble but honorable relationship to the unnameable, the cosmic mystery. This and many another similar experience could not be put into thoughts, let alone words. Even more remote from his way of thinking, even more impossible than any other thought, would have been words such as this. Is it only I alone who have created this experience, or is it objective reality? Does the master have the same feelings as I, or would mine amuse him? Are my thoughts new, unique, my own, or have the master and many before him experienced and thought exactly the same? No, for him there were no such analyses and differentiations. Everything was reality, was steeped in reality, full of it as bread dough is of yeast. The clouds, the moon, and the shifting scenes in the theater of the sky, the cold wet limestone under his bare feet, the damp, trickling cold dew in the pallid night air, the comforting home-like smell of hearth smoke and bed of leaves suffusing the skin the master had slung around him, the dignity and the faint note of old age and readiness for death in his rough voice. All that was beyond reality and penetrated almost violently into the boy's senses. And sense impressions are a deeper soil for growing memories than the best systems and analytical methods. Although the rainmaker was one of the few members of the tribe who had an occupation, who had developed a special art and ability, his everyday life outwardly did not differ greatly from that of the other members of the tribe. He was an important man with considerable prestige. He also received payment from the tribe whenever he had to do some service for the community, but this happened only on special occasions. By far his most important and sacred function came in the spring when he determined the proper day for sowing every kind of fruit and plant. He did this by carefully considering the state of the moon, partly by handed-down rules, partly by his own experience. But the solemn act of opening the season of seeding, the strewing of the first handful of grain and seeds on the community land, was no longer part of his office. That task was too high for any mere man. It was performed every year by the tribal mother herself or by her oldest female relative. The master became the principal person in the village only when he really had to function as weathermaker. This happened when a long drought, or a long spell of damp and cold, struck the fields and threatened the tribe with famine. Then Turu had to apply the methods effective against drought and poor crops: sacrifices, exorcisms, processions. According to legend, in cases of obstinate drought or endless rain, when all other means failed and the spirits could not be moved by persuasion, pleas, or threats, there was a last infallible method used in the days of the mothers and grandmothers: sacrifice of the weathermaker himself by the community. The tribal mother, it was said, had witnessed one such sacrifice. Aside from looking after the weather, the master also had a kind of private practice as an exorcist, as a maker of amulets and charms, and in some cases as a doctor, wherever medical matters were not reserved to the tribal mother. But for the rest, Master Turu lived the life of every other tribesman. He helped to till the common land when his turn came, and also had his own small garden near the hut. He gathered and stored fruit, mushrooms, and firewood. He hunted and fished, and kept a goat or two. As a farmer he was like all the others, but as hunter, fisherman, and herb gatherer he was not like anyone else. Rather, he was a solitary genius with a reputation for knowing a great many natural and magical tricks, devices, knacks, and aids. It was said he could weave a willow noose which no animal could escape. He had special recipes for fishbait, he knew how to lure crayfish, and there were some who thought that he understood the language of many a beast. But his real specialty was more arcane: observation of the moon and the stars, knowledge of the weather signs, ability to forecast weather and growth, and a command of many magical effects. Thus he was a great collector of plant and animal materials efficacious for remedies and poisons, for working magic, for conferring blessings, and for fending off dangerous spirits. He knew where to find even the rarest plants. He knew when they blossomed and ripened seed, and the right time to dig their roots. He knew where to find all kinds of snakes and toads, knew how to use horns, hoofs, claws, hair. He knew what to do with growths, deformities, weird and horrible excrescences, knots, tumors, burls, and scales, of wood, of leaves, of grain, of nuts, of horns and hoofs. Necht had more to learn with his feet and hands, his eyes, skin, ears, and nose, than with his intellect, and Turu taught far more by example and by dumb show than by words and prescription. The master rarely spoke coherently, and even when he did his words were only a supplement to his singularly impressive gestures. Knecht's apprenticeship differed little from the apprenticeship a young hunter or fisherman undergoes with a good master, and it gave him great pleasure, for he learned only the things that were already latent within him. He learned to be in wait, to listen, to stalk, to watch, to be on his guard, to be alert, to spy and sense. But the game that he and his master stalked was not only fox and badger, otter and toad, bird and fish, but essence, the whole, meaning, relationship. They sought to determine, to recognize, to guess and forecast the fleeting, unstable weather, to know the death lying hidden in a berry or snakebite, to eavesdrop on the secret relations between clouds or storms and the phases of the moon, relations that affected the growth of crops as they did the haleness or doom of man and beast. No doubt they were really seeking the same ends as the science and technology of later centuries, dominance over nature and a control over her laws, but they went about it in an entirely different way. They did not stand off from nature and try to penetrate into her secrets by violence. They were never opposed and hostile to nature, but always part of her and reverently devoted to her. It is quite likely that they knew her better and dealt more wisely with her. But one thing was utterly impossible for them. Not even in their most audacious moments would it have occurred to them to meet nature and the world of spirits without fear, let alone to feel superior to them. Such hubris was unthinkable. They could not have imagined having any other attitude but fear toward the forces of nature, toward death and the demons. Fear loomed over the life of man. It could not be overcome. But it could be pacified, outwitted, masked, brought within bounds, placed within the orderly framework of life as a whole. The various systems of sacrifices served this purpose. Fear was the permanent pressure upon the lives of these people, and without this high pressure their life would have lacked stress, of course, but also lacked intensity. A man who had been able to ennoble his fear by transforming part of it into awe had gained a great deal. People of this sort, people whose fear had become a form of piety, were the good men and the progressive men of that age. There were many sacrifices and many kinds of sacrifice, and a certain portion of these sacrifices, with their accompanying rites, fell within the province of the weathermaker. Alongside Necht in the hut, little Ada grew up, a pretty child, the old man's darling, and when he thought the time had come, he gave her to his disciple for a wife. From this point on Necht was considered the rainmaker's assistant. Turu presented him to the village mother as his son-in-law and successor, and thereafter allowed him to carry out many official acts and functions as his deputy. Gradually, as the seasons and years passed, the old rainmaker lapsed into the solitary meditativeness of age and left all his duties to Necht. By the time the old man was found dead, crouched over some small pots of magic brew on the hearth, his white hair singed by the fire, the boy, the disciple Necht, had long been familiar to the village as the rainmaker. He demanded that the village council provide an impressive funeral for his teacher, and as a sacrifice burned a whole heap of precious medicinal herbs and roots over the grave. That, too, had happened long ago, and several of Knecht's children already crowded Ada's hut, among them a boy named Turu. In him the old man had returned from his death flight to the moon. Necht fared much as had his teacher in times past. Part of his fear was transformed into piety and thought. Part of his youthful aspiration and his profound longings remained alive, part faded away and evaporated as he grew older in his work, in his love and solicitude for Ada and the children. His foremost passion was still for the moon and its influence upon the seasons and the weather. To this he devoted persistent study, and in knowledge of these matters he reached and ultimately surpassed his master, Turu. And because the waxing and waning of the moon are so closely bound up with the birth and death of men, because of all the fears in which men live, fear of having to die is the strongest, Necht acquired from his adoration and knowledge of the moon a devout and purified attitude toward death. In his riper years he was less subject to the fear of death than other men. He could speak reverently with the moon, or supplicatingly or tenderly. He knew that he was linked to it by delicate spiritual bonds. He knew the moon's life with great precision, shared with all the force of his own soul in the episodes of the moon's destiny. He experienced its disappearance and rebirth like a mystery within himself, suffered with it, felt alarm when the dreaded event occurred and the moon seemed exposed to illness and dangers, change and harm, when it lost its brightness, changed color, darkened until it seemed on the verge of extinction. At such times, it was true, everyone sympathized with the moon, trembled for it, recognized menace and the imminence of disaster in its eclipse, and stared anxiously at its old, ravaged face. But precisely at such times Rainmaker Necht showed that he was closer to the moon and knew more about it than others. For although he shared in its suffering, although his heart constricted with anxiety, his memory of similar experiences was keener, his confidence better founded. He had greater faith in eternity and a second coming, in the possibility of revising and conquering death. Greater, too, was the degree of his devotion. At such times he felt in himself a readiness to share the fate of the celestial orb to the point of doom and rebirth. At times he even felt something akin to temerity, a kind of rash courage and the resolution to defy death by the power of mind, to strengthen his own selfhood by surrender to superhuman destinies. Some trace of this was apparent in his manner. Others sensed it and regarded him as knowing and devout, a man of great calm and little fear of death, one who stood well with the higher powers. He had to prove these gifts and virtues in many hard tests. Once he had to withstand a period of poor crops and adverse weather that extended over 2 years. It was the greatest trial of his life. Troubles and bad portents had begun with the repeatedly postponed sowing, and then every imaginable misfortune had affected the crops, until in the end they were virtually destroyed. The village had starved cruelly, and Knecht, the rainmaker, with it. It was a considerable achievement in itself to have survived this bitter year without losing all credence and standing, so that he could still help the tribe bear the catastrophe with humility and some degree of composure. When the next year, after a hard winter in which many of the tribe perished, all the miseries of the preceding year were repeated, when during the summer the common land parched and cracked in a stubborn drought, the mice multiplied fearfully, and the solitary conjurations and sacrifices of the rainmaker proved as vain as the public ceremonies, the drum courses, and the processions of the whole community. When evidence mounted that this time the rainmaker could not make rain, it was no small matter and more than ordinary strength was needed to bear the responsibility and hold up his head against the frightened and infuriated people. There were 2 or 3 weeks in which Knecht stood entirely alone, confronting the entire village, confronting hunger and despair, confronting the ancient belief among the people that only sacrifice of the weathermaker could propitiate the powers. He had won the victory by yielding. He had not opposed the idea, had offered himself as the sacrifice. Moreover, with enormous toil and devotion he had helped to alleviate distress, had repeatedly discovered sources of water, divining a spring here, a trickling stream there. Even in a time of greatest distress he had not allowed the villagers to slaughter all their livestock. Above all, he had lent his support to the tribal mother, who had succumbed to fatalism and weakness in these difficult times. By advice, threat, magic, and prayer, by example and intimidation, he saved her from collapsing completely and letting everything drift wildly. In those times of calamity and universal anxiety it became apparent that a man is the more useful, the more his life and thinking is turned toward matters of the spirit, matters that go beyond the personal realm, the more he has learned to venerate, observe, worship, serve, and sacrifice. The 2 terrible years, which had almost cost him his life, ended with his being more highly regarded and trusted than ever, not by the thoughtless crowd, of course, but by the few who bore responsibility and were able to judge a man of his type. His life had passed through these and many other trials by the time he reached the best years of his maturity. He had officiated over the burial of 2 of the tribal mothers, had lost a charming 6-year-old son who had been carried off by a wolf. He had survived a severe illness without outside help, acting as his own physician. He had suffered hunger and cold. All this had marked his face, and his soul no less. He had also made the discovery that, in a certain peculiar manner, men of thought gave offense and aroused the repugnance of their fellows. They might be valued at a distance and called on in emergencies, but others neither love them nor accept them, rather give them a wide berth. He had also learned that the sick and unfortunate are far more receptive to traditional magic spells and exorcisms than to sensible advice. That people more readily accept affliction and outward penances than the task of changing themselves, or even examining themselves. That they believe more easily in magic than reason, in formulas than experience. These are matters which in the several thousand years since his era have probably not changed so much as a good many history books claim. But he had also learned that a seeking, thoughtful man dare not forfeit love, that he must meet the wishes and follies of men halfway, not showing arrogance but also not truckling to them, that it is always only a single step from sage to charlatan, from priest to mountebank, from helpful brother to parasitic drone, and that the people would by far prefer to pay a swindler and be exploited by a quack than accept help given freely and unselfishly. They would much rather pay in money and goods than in trust and love. They cheat one another and expect to be cheated themselves. You had to learn to see man as a weak, selfish, and cowardly creature. You also had to realize how many of these evil traits and impulses you shared yourself, and nevertheless you allowed yourself to believe, and nourished your soul on the faith, that man is also spirit and love, that something dwells in him which is at variance with his instincts and longs to refine them. But all these thoughts are no doubt far too abstract and explicit for Knecht to have been capable of them. Let us say, he was on the way to them, his way would some day lead him to them and past them. While he went his way, longing for abstract thought but living far more in the senses, in the spell of the moon, in the pungency of an herb, the saltiness of a root, the taste of a piece of bark, in cultivating simples, blending salves, submitting to the whims of weather and atmosphere, he developed many abilities within himself, including some that we of a later generation no longer possess and only half understand. The most important of these abilities was, of course, rainmaking. Although there were a good many special times when the sky stayed obdurate and seemed to mock his efforts, Knecht nevertheless made rain hundreds of times, and almost every time in a slightly different way. He would, of course, never have dared to make the slightest change or omission in the sacrifices and the rite of processions, conjurations, and drumming. But that was only the official, the public part of his work, the priestly side, which was for show. And undoubtedly it was very fine and produced a fine exalted feeling when after a day of sacrifices and processions the sky gave way in the evening, the horizon clouded over, the wind began to smell damp, the first drops of rain splattered down. But it had taken the weathermaker's art to choose the day well, not to strive blindly when the prospects were poor. You could implore the powers, even besiege them, but you had to do so with feeling and moderation, with submission to their will. Even more than those glorious triumphant experiences of felicitous intercession, he preferred certain others that no one but himself knew about, and even he knew about them only timorously, more with his senses than his understanding. There were weather conditions, tensions of the atmosphere and of heat, cloud formations and winds, smells of water and earth and dust, threats and promises, moods and whims of the weather demons, which Necht detected in advance with his skin, his hair, with all his senses, so that he could not be surprised by anything, could not be disappointed. He concentrated the very vibrations of the weather within himself, holding them within him in such a way that he could command the clouds and the winds, not, to be sure, just as he pleased, but out of the very intimacy and attachment he had with them, which totally erased the difference between him and the world, between inside and outside. At such times he could stand rapt, listening, or crouch rapt, with all his pores open, and not only feel the life of the winds and clouds within his own self, but also direct and engender it, somewhat in the way we can awaken and reproduce within ourselves a phrase of music that we know by heart. Then he needed only to hold his breath, and the wind or the thunder stopped. He needed only to nod or shake his head, and the hail pelted down or ceased. He needed only to express by a smile the balance of the conflicting forces within himself, and the billows of clouds would part, revealing the thin, bright blueness. There were many times of unusually pure harmony and composure in his soul when he carried the weather of the next few days within himself with infallible foreknowledge, as if the whole score were already written in his blood in such a way that the outside world must play every note exactly as it stood. Those were his best days, his reward, his delight. But when this intimate connection with the outside was broken, when the weather and the world were unfamiliar, incomprehensible, and unpredictable, then currents were interrupted and derangements occurred within him. Then he felt that he was not a real rainmaker, that his responsibility for weather and crops was an error and nuisance. At such times he was domestic, behaved obediently and helpfully toward Ada, sedulously shared the household tasks with her, made toys and tools for the children, pottered about preparing medicines, craved love and wanted nothing better than to differ as little as possible from other men, to conform wholly to them in customs and morals, and even to listen to the otherwise vexatious gossip of his wife and the neighboring women about the life, health, and conduct of others. But in good times his family saw little of him, for then he roamed, fished, hunted, searched for roots, lay in the grass or crouched in trees, sniffed, listened, imitated the voices of animals, kindled little fires and compared the shapes of the smoke clouds with the clouds in the sky, drenched his skin and hair with fog, rain, air, sun, or moonlight, and incidentally gathered, as his master and predecessor Turu had done in his lifetime, objects whose inner character and outward form seemed to belong to different realms, in which the wisdom or whimsicality of nature seemed to reveal some fragment of her rules and secrets of creation, objects which seemed to unite symbolically widely disparate ideas. Gnarled branches with the faces of men or animals, water-polished pebbles grained like wood, petrified animals of the primordial world, misshapen or twinned fruit pits, stones shaped like kidneys or hearts. He read the veinings of a leaf, the pattern on a mushroom cap, and divined mysteries, relations, futures, possibilities, the magic of symbols, the foreshadowing of numbers in writing, the reduction of infinitudes and multiplicities to simplicity, to system, to concept. For all these ways of comprehending the world through the mind no doubt lay within him, nameless, unnamed, but not inconceivable, not beyond the bounds of presentiment, still in the germ, but essential to his nature, part of him, growing organically within him. And if we were to go still further back beyond this rainmaker and his time which to us seems so early and primitive, if we were to go several thousands of years further back into the past, wherever we found man we would still find, this is our firm belief, the mind of man, that mind which has no beginning and always has contained everything that it later produces. The weathermaker was not destined to win immortality by any one of his premonitions, or to come any closer to proving their validity. For him, indeed, they scarcely needed proof. He did not become one of the many inventors of writing, nor of geometry, nor of medicine or astronomy. He remained an unknown link in the chain, but a link as indispensable as any other. He passed on what he had received, and he added what he had newly acquired by his own struggles. For he too had disciples. In the course of the years he trained 2 apprentices to be rainmakers, one of whom was later to become his successor. For long years he had gone about his affairs and practiced his craft alone and unobserved. Then, shortly after a great crop failure and time of famine, a boy started appearing, watching him, spying on him, adoring him, and generally skulking about. One who was drawn to rainmaking and the master. With a strange, sorrowful tug at his heart he sensed the recurrence and reversal of the great experience of his youth, and at the same time had that austere feeling, at once constricting and stirring, that afternoon had set in, that youth was gone and noonday past, that the blossom had become a fruit. And to his own surprise he behaved toward the boy exactly as old Turu had once behaved toward him. The stiff rebuff, the delaying, wait-and-see attitude, came of its own accord. It was neither an imitation of his deceased master nor did it spring from moralistic and pedagogic considerations that a young man must be tested for a long time to see whether he is serious enough, that initiation into mysteries should not be made easy, and similar theories. On the contrary, Knecht simply behaved toward his apprentices the way every somewhat aging solitary and learned eccentric behaves toward admirers and disciples. He was embarrassed, shy, distant, ready for flight, fearful for his lovely solitude and his freedom to roam in the wilderness, to go hunting and collecting alone, to dream and listen. He was full of a jealous love for all his habits and hobbies, his secrets and meditations. There could be no question of his embracing the timid youth who approached him with worshipful curiosity, no question of helping him overcome this timidity by encouraging him, no question of his rejoicing and having a sense of reward, appreciation, and pleasant success because the world of the others was at last sending him an emissary and a declaration of love, because someone was courting him, someone felt drawn to him, and like himself called to the service of mysteries. On the contrary, at first he felt it merely as a troublesome disturbance, infringement on his rights and habits, loss of his independence. For the first time he realized how much he prized that independence. He resisted the wooing and became clever at outwitting the boy and hiding himself, at covering his tracks, evading and escaping. But what had happened to Turu now happened to him also. The boy's long, mute courtship slowly softened his heart, slowly wore down his resistance, so that the more the boy gained ground, the more Necht learned to turn to him and open his mind to him, approve his longing, accept his courtship, and eventually come to regard the new and often vexatious duty of teaching and having a disciple as inevitable, imposed by fate, one of the requirements of a life of thought. More and more he had to bid farewell to the dream, the feeling and the pleasure of infinite potentialities, of a multiplicity of futures. Instead of the dream of unending progress, of the sum of all wisdom, his pupil stood by, a small, near, demanding reality, an intruder and nuisance, but no longer to be rebuffed or evaded. For the boy represented, after all, the only way into the real future, the one most important duty, the one narrow path along which the Rainmaker's life and acts, principles, thoughts, and glimmerings could be saved from death and continue their life in a small new bud. Sighing, gnashing his teeth, and smiling, he accepted the burden. But even in this important, perhaps most responsible aspect of his work, the passing on of tradition and the education of successors, the Weathermaker was not spared bitter disillusionment. The first apprentice who sued for his favor was named Morrow, and when after long delay and every form of deterrence he accepted the boy, Morrow disappointed him in a way he could never quite reconcile himself to. The boy was obsequious and wheedling, and for a long time pretended unconditional obedience, but he had certain faults. Above all, he lacked courage. He was especially afraid of night and darkness, a fact he tried to hide. Necht, when he noticed it at last, continued for a long time to regard it as lingering childishness which would eventually disappear. But it did not disappear. This disciple also completely lacked the gift of selfless devotion to observation for its own sake, to the procedures and processes of the Rainmaker's work, and to ideas and speculations. He was clever, had a quick, bright mind, and he learned easily and surely whatever could be learned without surrender of the self. But it became more and more apparent that he had self-seeking aims, and that it was for the sake of these that he wanted to learn rainmaking. Above all,